what he's read in the letters and what he's going to consider in making his decision as to what the appropriate sentence is. He's got to take everything into account. He's got to take that pre-sentence investigation that was prepared by the probation department. It goes into all the factors about Mr. Smollett's life, education, work, drug use, everything. Take into account the letters, take into account any statement that Mr. Smollett may want to make in trying to come up with a decision. And as I said earlier, I don't think that Judge Lynn has made a decision yet as to what the sentence is going to be. He wants to hear what Mr. Smollett says. He wants to hear from his mitigation witnesses, his family members, and again, I think he's going to take a serious account of what's in those letters, those mitigation letters that people took the time to write, and give a little insight into the life of Jussie Smollett.
So, Irv, you've known the judge here. I know you were talking about your relationship with him at various times, as you both have been in the court system here in Illinois over decades. And I thought it was interesting when he was cutting in, asking questions of Jussie Smollett's counsel. They seemed to be thoughtful. He wasn't really, getting an attitude by any means with her, but he definitely had pointed questions when she was talking about, for instance, whether he should have allowed all of the questions that she wanted at different parts in the procedure. So what's your take on that in terms of his ability to navigate attorneys who have extensive briefs and are willing to bring forth lengthy arguments at many times?
Well, you could tell by this hearing that when it comes to Judge Lynn making a ruling, he's short, sweet, to the point. He knows what he's doing. He knows the law, and he'll put his 2 cents worth when he thinks it's important and keep quiet when he doesn't think it's important. That's why he didn't address every issue that the defense brought forth today, but he was critical of some of the things that were said, particularly like the accountability.
The questions the defense requested of me, there were some I did not. For example, you wanted me to ask the denier, what kind of animal would you like to be if you had to be an animal? Or Superman or Batman, what do you prefer? Did you really think I was supposed to ask a denier when I'm choosing a jury in a criminal case, those kind of questions?
We identified certain questions in our motion that we think, I believe there were 4 questions that we thought were critical, not the ones Your Honor just mentioned, but there were important.
That was part of the pool of questions I received from you.
Right, but there were important questions that were not asked. And the more significant factor is we should have been allowed to question the veneer. In this case, again, I'm not saying in every case, I respect that Your Honor doesn't do that in a lot of other cases. However, this case is obviously unique. Mr. Smollett, unfortunately for him, has not been treated like anyone else charged with Class 4 felonies. He's been disadvantaged at every turn, and his jury selection. I pick a jury in this case the same way I pick a jury in a murder case. I do the questions. I ask the lawyers for input. Tell me what questions you want me to ask. I vet them, and I'm happy to ask the questions that are relevant and helpful. I understand, Your Honor.
But just the only point I'm trying to make is that I absolutely treated him the same as everybody else, and I didn't distinguish him from a Class 4 offender or potential offender from a person accused of murder.
What kind of animal would you be? Boy, he handled that with a lot of patience there, Irv. Okay, one more question I want to bring in my colleague, Brad, to continue this conversation. So just in terms of the players here, we, of course, have seen counsel for Jussie Smollett, and we know the special prosecutor. But there was another gentleman who spoke as well, and he was speaking directly to some of the points that Jussie Smollett's counsel made. Just take us through, so for those at home, they understand the key players here and how all this works together.
Well, right now you have the lead prosecutor, which is Dan Webb. He did not take part at all in this post-trial motion asking for a new trial. He let two of his assistants divvy up and basically each one do 50% of the argument. I guarantee you, I hate to guarantee things, but I guarantee you that he will take an active participation in this next phase that's coming up, the sentencing hearing, because the prosecutor's office always has a right to argue an aggravation. And I would be shocked if it's not Dan Webb who will be the participant doing that.
Thank you, Irv. And it's good to be back, Eric. Of course, trying to jump in and out for just a little bit because we are getting newscasts together at 4, 5, and 6 coming up with the news of the day and this. So, Irv, I want to go back to you. It was interesting when the defense was talking to the judge in this case. Although they said, with due respect and with respect and with respect, but there was clearly some combat going on, and there was clearly some consternation between the two parties. And then really, Team Webb doubled down on that. At one point in time, the first lawyer went into the soliloquy thanking the court for its prudence in handling the matter, thanking the sheriff's department, how remarkable it was they were able to do this all with COVID-19 happening. I know you can't really nickel and dime someone, but does the defense questioning the judge so hard, then, won't that have an effect on how he sentences Smollett, or does he just block that out, have ESP say that that's one part, we go on to the next?
He's gonna put that aside. He's really a fair judge. You mentioned, actually, Eric mentioned a few minutes ago that I've known him for a long time. I was actually a supervisor in the state's attorney's office. He goes out of his way to be fair, and you could tell by the colloquy that you heard between him and the defense attorney that he was trying to keep his cool. There's an expression that judges try to say once in a while: think it, don't say it. And you could just see that he wanted to say more and was holding back because he wanted to keep the decorum of the courtroom just the way it should be.
Yeah. So, Irv, we want to go back to a recap of some of the sound that came from the prosecution when they were talking about this blame game that was going back and forth. So let's go to that.
The evidence presented at trial, Your Honor, overwhelmingly established Mr. Smollett's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's reflected in the jurors' unanimous guilty verdict. And nevertheless, Mr. Smollett asked this court for extraordinary remedy, extraordinary relief, to overturn the jury's verdict that found him guilty of 5 serious felonies of making false police reports. And in doing so, he raises a variety of alleged errors, both pre-trial and during the trial itself, committed by anyone and everyone involved in this case, except, of course, Mr. Smollett himself or his lawyers. And just a few examples. He's blamed the prosecutors. He's blamed Your Honor specifically. He's blamed the courtroom staff. These are in his papers. He's blamed the Cook County sheriffs in this courtroom. He's blamed the entire Cook County judicial system. He's blamed the Illinois Supreme Court. He's blamed COVID-19. He's blamed the media. He's blamed, quote, political figures. He's blamed witnesses at trial. And he's even blamed the jury itself. Page after page after page of finger pointing and scapegoating. But once that bluster and hyperbole, Your Honor, is excised from that motion and the examination of the real underlying record is undertaken, it clearly reveals that each of the alleged errors is 1, meritless, 2, it is riddled with distortions of the actual record, and 3, frequent misapplication of controlling Illinois law. But most important, None of those alleged supposed errors remotely will rise to the level of, one, requiring overturning the jurors' unanimous verdict, nor two, the issuance of a new trial.
So Irv, there were a lot of clearlies in there, and I know this is a point that you were making well before the hearing even got into session here. You think in terms of the new trial motion that it's really the chances, the likelihood of this are nil.
I would say that because the procedural objections that the defense has, and which are typical, you either blame the judge for making mistakes, the jury for making mistakes, or the prosecutor for making mistakes. That's the typical areas that you go after in a motion for new trial. But as I said earlier, there's one other procedural issue, and that's whether or not this case should have been brought at all, whether or not Judge Tooman had the right to appoint a special prosecutor. And I think that's a ripe area for appeal. I'm not saying it's going to win, but I'm saying that's an area I think that the appellate courts may spend some time on trying to determine if any of this should even have taken place. So that's my 2 cents worth as far as where this may be going.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So you're saying, should it have even have gotten to the point where you have a judge who is then assigning a special prosecutor? Should it, as the defense argued, should it have been tied up and shut down when he basically forfeited his $10,000 bond, correct?
Exactly. And, you know, when the defense talked about, hey, listen, we made a deal with the prosecutor. The prosecutor had the right, Kim Fox, by the way, is the prosecutor. The defense has the right to rely on what the prosecutor says, and that shouldn't result in a new trial. I mean, a separate indictment, rather. I mean, last week we saw the United States Supreme Court deny the state of Pennsylvania's request to retry Bill Cosby because the prosecutor made a promise to him that they wouldn't use what he said against him. And that backfired on the prosecutor. So I'm not saying that that is totally on point, but I have to think you have to look at that as a little guidance. You know, when a prosecutor makes a promise, it's got to be kept. Whether or not this was considered a legal promise that has authority behind it, I think is a good question for the appellate court to decide.
Yeah, Irv, as you're talking here, we're starting to see live video back inside the courtroom. So, you know, as they adjourned, we went back up to the seal, and now we can see Jussie Smollett standing at his table with members of his group. And you can see just in terms of the perspective there, the judge sitting to the left and Jussie Smollett, as you pan across that, you can see where the special prosecution sits. And then you can get a view of who is inside the courtroom. And, you know, this is something that we don't often see. And we spoke about this before because there were requests, Irv, and you mentioned this previously, to do something unprecedented in a lot of these cases, which is actually to have the cameras in the courtroom. And that was at some point denied, and then it was allowed, Irv, is that right?
Well, it was denied for the trial because the judge was concerned that the jury would be tainted by what they would have seen by looking at television recaps at night, or people saying, hey, listen, I saw this on TV, you know, here's my opinion about it. So we protected Mr. Smollett's rights at trial. But there's really no need, there's no objection really to have a sentencing hearing be televised. The judge isn't going to be biased, isn't going to be prejudiced or tainted by anything that the media could do that would interfere with a fair sentencing hearing.
Okay. And there was also an interesting series of questions brought up. It was a really interesting series of arguments, even in about one juror in particular. But let's kind of get out of the weeds for the minute. Let's get into the bullpen. That's where the reporters are. That's where the gaggle is. And amongst them is CBS 2 investigator Dana Kozlov, political investigator. Dana, the mood down there, see any movement, hear anything? As we do see a little bit more movement in the courtroom, we may cut you off to fit any time, but kind of give us the latest there.
Yeah, really, it's just a lot of wait and see down here. Charlie DeMar, my colleague, of course, up in the courtroom, you know, getting a firsthand glimpse at the proceedings. But down here, it's quiet. No members of Jussie Smollett's entourage, if you will, came down that I could see during the break.
All right, Dana, as we said, we may need to cut you
court's
off.
resuming.
It
And
does
we can hear
appear.
that. Sounds like the judge is speaking. Let's listen in.
Sorry. Any corrections or amendments?
No correction, Judge.
All right. Then we'll proceed on further. I will inquire of the government, do you wish to present evidence in aggravation, either witnesses or documentary evidence?
The answer is yes, Your Honor.
Sure. You may do so.
Mr. Mendenhall will be presenting the witness statement.
Your Honor, I have a victim impact statement that I would like to, I've been asked to present on behalf of the city of Chicago and Superintendent Brown of the Chicago Police Department. As you correctly pointed out, is of some length, so I tried to condense, and I'm only going to read the relevant portion, but I will point out for the media and for the public watching, the full statement has been filed and made available to the court, as well as defense counsel. So again, Your Honor, the letters on behalf of Stephen Kane, Deputy Corporation Counsel, and David O. Brown, Superintendent, Chicago Police Department. As the jury concluded, Mr. Smollett falsely reported to the Chicago Police Department that he was a victim of a hate crime. Specifically, Mr. Smollett told the CPD that two people attacked him, placed a rope around his neck, poured a chemical on him, and called him homophobic and racist slurs, and stated that this is, quote, MAGA country, end quote. Mr. Smollett claimed he did not know his attackers, but that one of them was white-skinned. A massive investigation ensued, costing the city and its residents well over $100,000. For the following weeks, more than 30 Chicago police officers and detectives investigated Mr. Smollett's report by conducting witness interviews, reviewing over 1,500 hours of surveillance video, in-car camera videos from taxis collected by detectives, as well as other evidence. These same detectives also gathered documentary evidence, including rideshare records, store receipts, store videos, and knocked on doors, going door to door during the polar vortex, one of the coldest periods in Chicago history. During this period, the detectives and police officers worked around the clock, amassing over 1,000 hours of overtime in an effort to solve what in the beginning was thought to be a horrible hate crime. The overwhelming stress and fatigue that was put on the Chicago officers who were involved in the case was immense. While the city can address the financial costs of Mr. Smollett's false report and the investigation that ensued, a cost that can never be measured, is the harm caused by reducing the likelihood of actual victims of hate crimes willing to report these crimes. In CPD's experience, hate crime victims are frequently hesitant to come forward and cooperate in police investigations out of fear that they will not be believed or they will be targeted for additional crimes. Members of these communities often feel marginalized even before suffering the indignity of the hate crime. When crimes are not reported, the perpetrator is not punished and remains free to commit other crimes, endangering public safety. This is particularly problematic in the context of hate crime because these crimes harm not only the individual victim, but also others who share the victim's trait, creating fear in the broader community. Falsely reporting hate crime have a tremendous chilling effect on the real victims. Indeed, Mr. Smollett himself acknowledged that, quote, "You do a disservice when you lie about things like this," end quote. The financial cost of investigating Mr. Smollett's false hate crime report was significant. CPD spent 1,426 hours in regular shift time investigating his false reports at a cost of $67,734 in employee time. CPD also spent 1,837 overtime hours investigating Mr. Smollett's false report, costing the city $130,106. A spreadsheet calculating these expenditures is attached as Exhibit A. Your Honor, we respectfully submit that restitution for the city is warranted here. Illinois law authorizes restitution to compensate the victim of a crime for out-of-pocket expenses, damages, losses, or injuries found to have been proximately caused by the conduct of the defendant. Government victims may recover restitution for expenses that go beyond the normal cost of investigating crime. That is exactly what happened here. The city is a victim of Mr. Smollett's crime because of his false report caused CPD to expend scarce resources that could have been devoted to solving actual crimes, increasing public safety. The city is not seeking restitution for the regular salaries of the officers involved, but CPD's overtime expenses that go beyond the normal cost of investigating crime and are thus recoverable. A restitution award as part of Mr. Smollett's criminal sentence would enable the city to avoid these costs and delays. For these reasons, we respectfully request that you seek restitution for the city in the amount of $130,106 as part of Mr. Smollett's sentence. Sincerely, Stephen J. Kane, Deputy Corporation Counsel, City of Chicago. David O. Brown, Superintendent, Chicago Police Department. Your Honor, a copy of the full letter has been made a part of the record. Thank you.
Received. Thank you. Does that conclude your evidence and aggravation?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Does the defense have evidence, witnesses, or documents that they wish to present in mitigation?
Yes, Your Honor.
Sure, you may proceed, Ms. Allen.
Thank you.
Judge Booth called witness Rich Daniels.
Rich Daniels, sir, please step up right here. Hi. Please raise your right hand. You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
All right. Please have a seat. Try to keep your voice up. You're welcome to take your mask off if you want to. If you prefer to keep it on, that's okay too. It's entirely up to you.
Thank you.
Ms. Waddell, you may pardon.
Thank you very much, Judge. Sir, in a loud, clear voice, would you please introduce yourself, state your first and last name, and spell your last name?
Sure. My name is Richard Daniels. My last name is Daniels. And I'm sorry, what else did you ask?
Sorry. Mr. Daniels, how old are you?
Oh, really?
Yes, sir.
I'm 61 years old.
All right. And are you familiar with a person by the name of Jussie Smollett?
Yes, I am.
How are you familiar with him?
I met Jussie 8 years ago this month when I was the music director on the television show Empire, for which I was the on-camera music person for all 102 episodes in all 6 seasons.
So in what capacity did you know Mr. Smollett while working on Empire?
Jussie was the breakout music star on the show, and as the music director for the on-camera work, I worked with him closely, daily, for many years of the show, as helping to support him in terms of his role on the show.
All right. Now, in terms of his role in the show musically, how did you help support him in that way?
We put musicians on camera around him in the 6 seasons that we did Empire. We would put around Jussie and other cast members and guest artists, musicians from the community. So 400 different musicians and vocalists appeared on that show from the local Chicago community over the 6 seasons we had the show, many of which performed with Jussie, and many of which he embraced dearly as friends over that period of time.
Did Mr. Smollett also have any hand in making sure, securing any of these musical artists?
He would sometimes voice opinions and give me approval or tell me what he's looking for. So of course there was interaction that way. And through that process, we became very good friends.
So outside of the show, you said you became very good friends. What type of things would you say you did with Mr. Smollett?
I was very active, and I continue to be active in the world of nonprofits in Chicago, supporting various things. And so I would tell Jussie about certain things that we were active with. And as a celebrity, I would say it would be very meaningful if you might consider participating and donating your time and your talent, which he willingly did on many occasions. And it was always a very meaningful experience for those who saw him and interacted with him, and meaningful for those of us who brought him out.
Now, Mr. Daniels, I'm going to ask you briefly to, if you can, go through just a few of these nonprofits or any of them. I know that there's one that was relevant with the Boys and Girls Clubs of America.
That was a meeting we had that never went beyond the meeting stages. But the one that was really relevant was a school on the west side of Chicago, a grade school. And it has 505 African-American children. I believe it's the largest population of African-American children in the grade school system in America. That's what they talk about. Magnificent school. I was brought in a few years prior to Jussie coming in, asking to support it in various ways. And their mission was so great, it was easy to jump in. I asked Jussie if he'd come over. He willingly said yes. And for me, it was an extraordinary life experience because we didn't tell the children who was coming that day. It also led me to believe of what a huge show Empire had become in the African-American community. We didn't tell the children he was coming to their classrooms that day. Each classroom we walked into with Jussie, the children jumped up with joy, ran to him, hugged him, cried with him. It was an amazing experience. It was cathartic to witness it and to see it happen because the impact he had as his celebrity and as this loving, wonderful young man was dramatic. It was really quite something. I was very taken by it, as were those who were with me that day, as were the people who were administrators at the facility. And that was one example of the many that he participated in, giving his time and his talent. He is a very charismatic young man. He's a very loving and caring young man. And he was generous and he was thoughtful, and he was kind, funny and intelligent, and I just think the world of him.
Now, aside from his time, talents, energies, charisma, all of these beautiful things that you just stated about Mr. Smollett that he willingly and abundantly gives, would you say that he gives anything else of himself or from himself to communities or anybody else around him?
I know of charitable contributions he's made in large sums of money, and I know of large projects he supported financially in addition to his time and talent. So he covered all the bases of time, treasure, and talent in terms of his giving and his willing to participate in the community. And it was always with a loving heart. It was always with a willingness to do good and to give back to what he had been given. He knew he was a lucky young man. You know, this show Empire, this was catching lightning in a bottle for all of us who were able to be on it. There were 593 scripted television shows made in America last year. 593. I think back to when I was a kid and there were like 12. And there were 593. So content is everything. So the competition is fierce. Empire was one of 3% of all television shows to get beyond 5 seasons. Doesn't happen. You know, we think of shows that have long lives to them. That's fine. But the number of shows that have long lives, very few and far between. So Jussie had an appreciation for that, what he was given, as did all of us on that show. It was a game changer for Chicago. The community embraced that show in huge ways. The first episode of season 2 had 29 million viewers. Those are major sporting event numbers. And that made Jussie a huge presence in the community, both in television and in the community at large.
Would you say that based on all of Mr. Smollett's contributions, that he was absolutely a pivotal part in the show's success?
Oh, he was. He was the music star of the show. I'm sure that Terrence and Taraj and anybody else would tell you the same thing. Jussie was the music star of the show. Everyone else participated in it, but he was the day in, day out go-to music guy. He was our breakout music star on the show.
Now, Mr. Daniels, would you be willing and able to support Mr. Smollett if he were given a chance at a term of probation in this matter?
Of course. It's part of my daily activities in Chicago and the thing I'm most proud of.
You don't believe that there would be any issues that Mr. Smollett would ever exhibit on a period of probation?
None that I would have ever seen or ever thought of.
You have one moment, sir.
Is it okay to take a sip?
Yes, sir. Just going back briefly, Mr. Daniels, of all of the incredible services you said Mr. Smollett gave himself to willingly, those were not required of Mr. Smollett in any way, were they?
They were not.
Neither by the show or any agency that you're aware of?
No, absolutely not.
So you believe that in addition to any of the again, services that Mr. Smollett gives willingly of himself, that if you were given a term of either probation or some kind of community service, would you be willing or able to either supervise that or make sure that he would be compliant and continue to give himself to community service and service of others?
Absolutely. Happy to.
Thank you, Mr. Daniels.
Thank you.
Any cross-examination?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Daniels, thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
May I call your next witness?
Yes, Ms. Gilman.
Please step up. Please raise your right hand. You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Please be seated. Try to keep your voice up. You're welcome to take your mask off if you like. If you want to keep it on, it's entirely up to you. Both masks. Mr. Allen, you may depart.
Thank you. May I please state your name
Sharon Gelman,
and spell your first and last name for me?
SharonGelman.
I know my mother would kill me for this question, but I'm not going to have to ask how old are you?
62.
And what do you do for work?
Well, now I'm a writer, editor, and a nonprofit consultant, but for many years I ran a nonprofit called Artists for New South Africa.
Okay. Without telling me your address or anything, what state do you live in?
I now reside in Maryland in the Washington, D.C. area.
And did you fly in for this specific purpose?
I did.
And why specifically did you fly in for this purpose?
Jussie's like family to me. I've known him for well over half of his life and a good chunk of my own. And I came because I was hoping that I could help people see the Jussie that I know.
So do you remember around the time you first met Jussie?
I met him in 1999.
That's very specific, okay? And why does that stick out, 1999 when you met him?
We were producing an event. It was the 10th anniversary of my organization's existence. And it was the 5th anniversary of South Africa's new democracy. And we were doing a specific portion of the event. Desmond Tutu was our keynote speaker and ambassadors and Sidney Poitier. We were doing a specific portion which was about the role of young people in the struggle against apartheid. And I asked the artists who were founders and our board members who would be like a wonderful young artist, someone with great talent and great to include. And they all suggested Journey Smollett, and it was in that context that I met Jussie, who at that time was representing her, working on her behalf.
So back in 99, Jussie would have been a younger man.
He was 16.
Right. Even back then, what were your impressions of Jussie?
Well, he was when I called and spoke to him, we wrote a letter asking Journey to participate. And I got a very professional phone call back from someone named Jussie, and I was very impressed with him. And he said, I do public relations for Journey. And then he came into the office to meet me, and in walked this like utterly beautiful young man. And I was like, oh my God, you're a baby. And that was when I learned he was Journey's brother.
Did you even get the feeling back then in 99 that Jussie understood the significance of the event that he was attending in South Africa?
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, the whole Smollett family is very charitably and politically engaged. And Jussie and Journey were very excited to be involved. I mean, I think Jussie, because being raised up and exposed to the arts and entertainment community from a very, very young age as little children, they understood the power that fame confers, and they also understood the responsibility. So they loved the idea of using Journey's very baby, embryonic star power to do something good in the world.
Sure. So after 99, did you continue to have a relationship with Jussie?
Yes, Journey and Jussie and Jake and Jazz and Janet, the whole J family, would often come in and volunteer. They would stuff envelopes. I mean, they were like a all-service vehicle that, you know, it's like, do you need us on stage? Do you need us sweeping the floor? They would just do all kinds of things. And then, gosh, I think it was around 2006. It might have been late 2005. We needed another staff person. We were a tiny organization, and I hired Jussie then, and he came and worked for me full time for 4 years in the office.
What was Jussie's role after he was hired?
Well, he started off as my administrative assistant, and he will forgive me, I hope, by saying that Jussie has many talents. Paperwork is not really one of them, but he was so good with the staff and with our volunteers and with our interns. I mean, we were a tiny organization, and we did big things, and we depended on the largesse, not only of our celebrity members, but also of students and grassroots community folks who came in. And Jussie just was really stellar at making everyone involved, from the highest and mightiest and most world-renowned to, you know, the kids we were working with in the inner city, making them feel special and welcome. And we worked really hard, and he was one of those people who had the rare gift of making hard work fun. So he really played a very, very pivotal role, and I promoted him pretty quickly. He became the coordinator and manager of our charity auctions, and then we produced an audiobook in honor of we announced it on Mr. Mandela's 90th birthday, and we released it on its 91st birthday with a major publisher and 26 celebrities from all over the world, renowned people of all backgrounds. And Jussie, you know, was very involved in coordinating that. And as I said, he was willing to do anything. He was willing to, you know, go pick people up. He was a good photographer, so he would document the sessions. You know, anything that needed doing, Jussie was willing to do it.
I got a little starstruck when I heard Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu. So what exactly did your organization do?
Well, we were founded in 1989. Alfre Woodard and brought together a bunch of people. It was during the height. We didn't realize then that it was towards the end of apartheid, but it was the height of still continued conflict. And she had been with the Congressional Black Caucus, and they were talking about people needed to go back and work in their communities. So Alfre came back and organized her community, and I got involved. I think I showed up at the third meeting. I heard about it, and I never left. We raised money. We raised awareness. We over our years, we raised and granted $9 million to frontline groups in South Africa African-based, African-led organizations doing AIDS work, democratic development, youth education, economic development. And we harnessed the ability of our members to raise awareness about HIV/AIDS prevention and treatment, about the voting process, both in South Africa and in the US. We always tried to match what we were doing in South Africa with a related issue locally, either in Los Angeles or in the United States, so that we weren't, being those people who care a whole lot about something thousands of miles away, but don't care about the community that you can drive to or live in.
So during Jussie's time working there, I heard that you put him in charge of charitable contributions,
charitable auctions.
Charitable auctions, which seems like a very important job. Can you describe that?
He did. I mean, that was one of the things he did. But for that, what he would do is he would contact our donors and celebrity members and others of resources and ask for things that we could either auction off live or online, so live at a big event or online. And so it would be everything from, I think our two highest money-making things, or our three, were Jillian Anderson, who was a board member, gave us passes to the wrap party for the final season of X-Files. Jackson Brown let us auction off, I think it was, well, he let us auction off someone coming and working with him in a studio to record their song, which ended up being a really long process because the person wasn't a musician, but we earned a lot of charity dollars in the process. And then I think our other highest generating item was a luncheon, private luncheon with Archbishop Desmond Tutu.
So this was from 1999 when you first met Jussie. Now we're at from 1999 to 2010, since you worked those 4 years. Can you explain the growth in his character you observed during that time?
Well, Jussie, I mean, obviously he went from being a very young, adolescent to an adult. I mean, I would say his character was the same. He was a very open-hearted, hardworking, pure-hearted person. I mean, he didn't have a car. He rode a bus 1 hour each way to our office. And sometimes I would drive him partway home. And he would always be like, no, I'm fine. I don't mind. It's like, he was like, I'm so excited to get up every morning and do something to make the world a better place. I mean, he was like evangelical in that way of really believing in the cause. And he got paid very little. We wanted all of our money to go to the front lines, but nonetheless, he got paid really little. And every time I would sort of apologize to him for that, he would be like, no, I'm so like, I feel so excited and lucky to be part of this. And we became friends. I mean, I loved all my employees and I believed in them, but Jussie and I also became real friends.
So after 2010, you kept in contact with Jussie?
Oh, absolutely, regularly.
In what way, mostly?
Well, sometimes it would be him wanting to figure out a way to make a difference. So he had witnessed all these people, Sam Jackson, Denzel Washington, Sidney Poitier, who could use their position to benefit others. And so that was such a deep part of who Jussie was. And he also understood it from helping those people to do that work. So sometimes he would call. I remember him calling me right when the story broke about the water in Flint, Michigan. And he was literally sobbing on the phone, just going like, I can't believe what's going on. And I really want to make a difference. And here's what I'm sort of thinking of. And would you help me figure out if it's the right way to go? And I want to give money, but I also want to go and bring supplies, but I also just want to show up for people. And I wanted, he was always trying to figure out how to do what he could do best. And a lot of what he did in those ways, I mean, he understood the power of standing up for people and that the TV cameras would follow and that maybe others would follow his example. But he also did a lot of what he did during that time anonymously and quietly. But he still did the due diligence of figuring out which group is good and how do you figure that out. And I'm going to call people I know and do my research so that my dollars are well spent and are making a real difference.
Sure. So Jussie went from taking a bus to your office to becoming a worldwide phenomenon on a TV show. Did you notice any change in his personality when he gained that phenomenal success?
Not really. I mean, he was still Jussie. He was funny and sweet, and he was so like, effervescent about this magical thing that had happened to him. And I think for all of us who worked with him at ANSA, Artists for New South Africa, whether board members or, I mean, we were all so thrilled for him. It was like, you know, we all knew he was talented. We had him perform at a couple of our events once he started performing musically, and we were all fans. And but you know, I mean, he wore it well. He wore his fame responsibly, and he understood sort of the requirements that come with that kind of position if you want to be a good decent person living in the world.
So if Jussie was given a period of probation in this case, would you be willing to help supervise to make sure that that probation period goes fantastic?
Absolutely. I mean, I call on Jussie. I've called on Jussie to help me on things all in these years after he's worked for me. I mean, most recently, in the middle of all of this, I was helping with an auction for Desmond Tutu's 90th, which ended up being his final birthday before he died. And I called Jussie and asked for his help. And I was like, I'm sorry to do this while you're going through all this. And he's like, no, God, this is like, thank you. This gives me something else to think about. And he really went out of his way, bent over backwards to try and get some contributions. So I would be honored and would take it very seriously if to help Jussie continue to be a really deeply contributing member to society.
One moment, please. Sure. Okay, no further questions.
Any cross-examination?
No cross-examination, Your Honor.
Spellman, thank you, Kennedy.
Thank you.
Other witnesses you care to call?
Yes, Judge. Judge, we'll be calling Joe Smollett, Mr. Smollett's older brother. He's going to give a statement to the court. Then afterwards, Mrs. Smollett's grandmother will
Sure.
also give a statement.
You come up on the witness stand, please.
Can you go right here?
If he prefers.
Yeah.
He's just going to read a statement and there it is.
Yeah.
All right, I'm not going to put him under oath. I don't think it's required, but please, Mr. Smollett.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. Your Honor, before I just want to say a few things. I don't know if it was done sarcastically, but mentioned my family earlier, Mr. Weaver, about us passing notes and prayer sessions. Try to understand that my brother right here is on trial. And while this might just be a level 4 felony to a lot of people, under the circumstances, this is felt like the reincarnation of Al Capone's trial, okay? To be honest. And it's not your fault. I'm not trying to say it's your fault. I'm saying, but the way that this has been, so that's probably the reason you see us sharing notes and doing prayer sessions. My mom's 69 years old. She was born in 1952 in Texas, right? She knows the thing about racism. She doesn't really need a lecture about the extent of racism. Neither does an openly gay African-American man, all right? I strongly believe, you know what I'm going to say, I strongly believe in my brother's innocence. But I'm not going to rehash or try to relitigate the issues in the case today. Your Honor, I come before you humbly to request leniency when you sentence my brother. Please remember that we are currently living in a time in which we are enduring a vicious pandemic, extreme economic uncertainty, a major conflict in Eastern Europe, and global paradigm shifts taking place everywhere. As human beings, we are collectively worn down. But Jussie Smollett is not at the source of the socioeconomic and political problems on earth. On quite the contrary, he is a man who has been a beacon of hope, charity, and philanthropy to his nation and to his community. He has made real efforts in his lifetime to promote equality and love among all of humanity. He has expressed strong political views and has stood against injustice wherever he thinks it may lie. His criticism of powerful individuals, organizations, and practices does not make him a bad person. okay? Or someone who should be punished. It simply makes him an American. I'm sure that Mr. Dan Webb, when I was once on former President Ronald Reagan's radar for his criticism during the Iran-Contra prosecutions, all right? But standing up to powers and authorities in America is what makes us, part of what makes us American. And he turned out to have a pretty successful career after he stood up to power. Jussie does not have malice or hatred toward anyone, and it is truly unfortunate that his reputation has received so many negative connotations, and he has never received the benefit of the doubt or a proper presumption of innocence. And even though I completely disagree with the jury's decision in this case, I am not attempting to rehash it here. I only want to give support to the point that Jussie should not be incarcerated.
Continuing to
I think I'm biased. I am 5 years older than he is, and I can remember him at infancy. He has always been a loyal, loving, and creative human being. He is not a threat to the people of Illinois. And in my humble opinion, Jussie is completely innocent, but even for those, once again, who think he is guilty, the crime he has been accused of is not even considered a felony in most states. Furthermore, here in Illinois and in Cook County, disorderly conduct is oftentimes not even prosecuted and charges are frequently dropped. Incarceration of any kind would send the wrong message, especially in a time in which we as a nation have expressed in a bipartisan plurality the desire to see real criminal justice reform and an end to unnecessary mass incarceration, which predominantly affects African Americans, Hispanics and Latinos, and poor and impoverished white people. We also know now that as a nation that calls itself free, we cannot do so while continuing to incarcerate more nonviolent offenders than any other nation in the world. Mass incarceration is also an unnecessary burden to the taxpayers, to law enforcement, and it is simply unjust and wrong. For those who believe that Jussie is guilty once again and needs more punishment, I would also ask you to consider the gut-wrenching and stomach-turning punishment he has already experienced for the last 3 years. The TV show that he poured so much labor and commitment into making a success was ripped away from him even before he was criminally tried. The fact is, the overwhelming majority of mass and online media reporting in early 2019 resulted in a premature assumption of guilt, and the court of public opinion had already convicted Jussie in early 2019. For the last 3 years, he has had to live in anxiety and in a certain kind of pseudo form of house arrest. As a public figure, he has had to deal with public scorn and the real security threats associated with being an accused celebrity. He was, in essence, quarantining almost a year before the COVID-19 pandemic even began. Now, we all know the Sixth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution guarantees the right to a speedy trial. In my opinion, it is unfathomable for me to stand here in March of 2022, pleading with Your Honor not to give my brother jail time for a low-level offense that is alleged to have been committed in early 2019. For those who believe he is guilty, once again, trust me when I say that the punishment he has already received has far exceeded the actual alleged offense that you accuse him of. Your Honor, there's been a lot talked about, restoring public trust. In my opinion, you don't restore public trust by demonstrating to the public that a level 4 felony, which once again is not even what he's accused of, not even a felony charge in most states in America, by giving him a stiff sentence, which includes jail time. That's not restoring public trust. That's in my opinion, right? And if you were to go 5 miles in any direction in this area, from this courthouse, and talk to people in the community, you're not going to say, they're not going to tell you, oh yeah, we restored the public trust because Jussie Smollett went to jail. Trust me, it's not going to happen, all right? This is not restoring public trust, all right? We are dealing with a lot of things in the world right now, and sending him to jail would not be restoring public trust. So please also keep in mind that, like myself, many people view this case as nothing more than a he said, she said kind of case, right? With no evidence to have warranted his conviction in the first place. With that in mind, Your Honor, I am humbly requesting that your sentencing of my brother not include any incarceration. I myself and my entire family will be eternally grateful. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir. Is there an additional witness that would like to say something today?
Yes.
Mr. Allen, how about a chair? Would that be helpful?
I'm gonna.
I need a mic.
She's the boss, Judge. She's gonna tell me where to go.
I want to be heard.
Okay. Fair enough.
Thank you so much. Okay. Good to be here, okay? I thank you for this opportunity to allow me to make this statement. My name is Molly Smollett. I am 92 years old. I have lived in New Mexico for over 25 years, but I am originally from New York, where I was a film editor. I am the proud grandmother of Jussie and his siblings. I felt compelled to come and tell you that the Jussie I know and love does not match up with the media's betrayal of him. And I'm talking to you guys. You haven't done a good job on investigative reporting. I've worked on documentaries. I know what it is. I've gone through the McCarthy period. I marched with Martin Luther King and marched on Washington, and I'm here now. And so you got to do better. I challenge you to do more investigative reporting. Jussie himself, as you have heard from the testimonials, is a very gentle, kind, and generous young man, and his empathy, which translates in giving of himself. Jussie has always been active in the pressing issues facing our communities, such as HIV, AIDS, voting rights, and other urgent social problems in America. One Christmas, he went to Flint, Michigan to entertain children who were living with lead poisoning from their drinking water. What the media may not know is that Jussie is what I call a justice warrior. He has been active against injustice all his life, as his mother has, who is an incredible rock for her children. And as my son, their father, who sadly passed away from cancer 7 years ago, only in his 50s. And I know in my heart that my son, Jussie's father, would have wanted me to come here to tell you who the real Jussie is. I also have fought against injustice forever, and I feel it's in our DNA. I attribute this to being Jewish and the persecution of my ancestors. The Hebrew words tikkun olam means to repair the world, and that's what I do, and that's what Jussie does. I will end by saying that Jussie is loved and respected by all who know him. And I ask you, the judge, not to send him to prison. If you do, send me along with him, okay? And I thank you for letting me talk. Thank you so much. Thank you all. It's nice to be in Chicago.
She packed quite a lot in those few minutes, of course, addressing the media, talking about her own background.
Suffered so much. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry. Stucci, any other live witnesses you care to present today?
Judge, not at this time. I believe, I'm just checking, Mr. Allen. Okay, no, Judge, just the statements to be.
Okay. All right, I've heard evidence in aggravation, evidence in mitigation. I'll now entertain arguments in aggravation and mitigation, starting with the Office of Special Prosecutor.
I'm sorry, Your Honor.
I'm sorry, excuse
You
me.
wanted to, you want us to.
Yes, okay, okay, I know what you're talking about. I have received numerous letters on behalf of Mr. Smollett. Some of them as recent as today, this morning. And I think it's only fair to publish and spread of record who those letters are from. Generally, they're all asking for mercy. They all know him in different capacities. They're strongly advocating for him, but you can tell me who those letters are from. And I think the special prosecutors also received the same letters that I've received.
Yes, Your Honor.
And if you want to paraphrase a little bit from the letters, Mr. Allen, you're welcome to.
Sure. Your Honor, the first letter here is from the organization Black Lives Matter. Dear Judge Lynn, Black Lives Matter stands in strong support of an alternative to incarceration sentence for Jussie Smollett. We applaud your long-held practice of imposing alternative to incarceration sentences for virtually all Class 4 felonies, such as Mr. Smollett's, and encourage you to continue this practice in this case. We know that second chance probation, regular probation, and deferred prosecution are all options. As we contemplate what creates a truly safe world, we know that Mr. Smollett's case involves no drugs, no theft, no sex, no property damage, and no physical injury to anyone other than the defendant. Despite the attention paid to it by the media, at its heart, this case involves a low-level, non-violent offense. We urge the court to keep this truth in mind when sentencing Mr. Smollett. We know that the cost that will be expended to met out the sentence involving jail time will be much better used providing much-needed community service. We first came to know Mr. Smollett long before Black Lives Matter's growth into the largest racial and social justice movement in global history. Mr. Smollett has an extensive history in civil rights advocacy and philanthropy. Mr. Smollett personally donated more than $500,000 to Black organizations and gave $125,000 in proceeds from his music tour to organizations working for Black, LGBTQ+, and women's rights, including Black AIDS Institute, which provides high-quality direct HIV services to Black people, Flint Kids Fund, which funds programs aimed to address and mitigate the impact of lead poisoning and trauma suffered by many children in Flint, Michigan, the Trayvon Martin Foundation, whose main purpose is to provide emotional and financial support to families who have lost their child to gun violence, and Know Your Rights Camp, whose mission is to advance the liberation and well-being of Black and brown communities through education, self-empowerment, mass mobilization, and the creation of new systems to elevate the next generation of change leaders. In 2018, after learning that Bennett College, an all-women's HBCU, was on the brink of losing its accreditation, Mr. Smollett and his brother helped the institution raise the funds needed to retain accreditation. In fact, although the college needed only $5 million, Mr. Smollett and his brother led a campaign that raised $8 million. Beyond his financial contributions, Mr. Smollett has been a fixture in civil rights organizing. We have marched alongside Jussie in fights for healthcare, to draw attention and resources to the AIDS epidemic, for women's rights, to protect the sanctity of families, and in peace walks. Our relationship with Jussie goes back to the early years of Black Lives Matter, or at least 2016. It has continued, despite his struggles with this case. Most recently, we sat with Mr. Smollett during the anniversary of Trayvon Martin in February 2022, where he flew to Miami to serve as a loving face in the crowd of support families whose loved ones were stolen by police and or vigilante violence. In short, Mr. Smollett has demonstrated a long-standing commitment to helping others. Incarcerating Mr. Smollett would be solely punitive in nature. Mr. Smollett does not pose a threat to anyone. Thus, we respectfully request that this court impose a sentence that is an alternative to incarceration, and that's sincerely Melina Abdullah, PhD, the director of Black Lives Matter Grassroots. Also have a letter here from Latanya and Samuel L. Jackson. It's very short, so. I write to you today to ask for mercy as you sentence Jussie Smollett. I understand the difficult nature of your job as you seek to make decisions which take into account the crime and the punishment. It is with respect of knowing this that I humbly implore you to please find an alternative to incarceration for Jussie Smollett. It is my understanding that Jussie was convicted of Class 4 disorderly conduct, which, to my understanding, people convicted of this offense historically are sentenced to various alternatives to incarceration. My husband, actor Samuel Jackson, and I have known Jussie since he was a baby living down the street from us in New York City. We watched him grow from a child who was always kind, full of laughter and joy, into a responsible teenager who, becoming aware of the inequities suffered by some people in life, became an energetic volunteer helping anyone who was working to alleviate those inequities. Additionally, as a young man, we have worked side by side with Jussie and organizations committing to stopping the HIV/AIDS epidemic in America, as well as dispensing aid to Africa and Israel. Jussie has used his celebrity to impact community outreach work, such as providing water during the Flint, Michigan crisis. We have often broken bread with this young man as we have discussed the right and wrong ways to live. Jussie comes from a family whom we are proud to know intimately, and who we stand ready to provide the support and monitoring assistance that can provide for him in an alternative to probation scenario. Jussie has no prior criminal record and has never been violent. It is incredulous to Sam and to me that this entire criminal situation even exists. Jussie has already suffered a great deal of punishment, as this situation has destroyed his existing career and has impugned his reputation. Please, Judge Lynn, in God's name, please save this young man and allow him to be of service. Jussie Smollett is worth the risk and the investment. Respectfully, Latanya Jackson and Samuel L. Jackson. And we have more now.
Mr. Lewis.
Hey, Judge. Judge, if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'd like to read a letter from the Rainbow Push Coalition that was submitted in support of our client. Dear Judge Lynn, I write as someone who has known Jussie Smollett for over 20 years. I know him to have a strong family background. He is a loving and caring person, and I am familiar with his commitment to community service. It is important to him to use his gifts to support the needs of others. Jussie was raised in a strong and very close-knit family. I urge you to consider several moral issues as you weigh sentencing options. Jussie has no prior felony convictions. He has a history of community service and charitable giving of his time, talent, and treasury. He has sustained a significant loss of income prior to being convicted of any crime. Based on the very public nature of the charges and the trial, Jussie has lost countless career opportunities. I have served as a citizen devoted to having a positive impact on the lives of young men and women in the city of Chicago since 1968. In pursuit of that mission, I have visited the Cook County Jail and several Illinois prisons every year since Operation Breadbasket launched. I have seen firsthand the disastrous impact the jail has on far too many young people of color, especially young African-American men, who often see a complete loss of hope in their situations. Since this case involves the alleged actions of a very visible public figure, it presents a unique opportunity to send a message to millions of young Black and brown men that the system cares for them. This highly publicized Class 4 felony case can be utilized as a positive teaching moment about how the criminal justice system can work to benefit all in our society. I appeal to you in the spirit of righteousness to consider the impact America's criminal justice system has on young Black males who struggle every day to survive the streets of urban America. We have an obligation as a society to favor restorative justice rather than retributive justice. Jussie Smollett was convicted of a Class 4 felony, the least severe category of felony in Illinois. A well-established practice in Cook County is to sentence Class 4 disorderly conduct cases to incarceration alternatives. Such alternatives might include second chance probation, regular probation, or deferred prosecution. Additionally, an important consideration in sentencing is the potential for recidivism. Jussie Smollett's lack of felony criminal record, as well as many positive contributions to society, demonstrates that he poses no risk for recidivism. Jussie has a long track record of being deeply engaged and contributing citizen who is committed to helping the most vulnerable in our society, whether persons living with HIV/AIDS and children orphaned by the disease,
or children whose health was damaged by the contaminated water in Flint, Michigan. Jussie's commitment to serving the community began as a child. As he found professional success, he continued to donate time and money to charitable causes. Another factor that we urge your honor to consider is that the crime did not involve violence to others. None of the actions charged indicate that Jussie ever posed a threat to public safety. Further, Jussie has already suffered. He has been vilified in the court of public opinion. His professional reputation has been severely damaged. He has suffered loss career opportunities, a loss of income, and there are a number of people who rely on Jussie for financial assistance. Finally, I am deeply concerned about the physical safety and well-being of a well-known, non-violent Black gay man with a Jewish heritage who may be incarcerated within the U.S. prison system. For all the foregoing reasons, I believe the only fair and just outcome is to sentence Jussie Smollett to a non-incarceration alternative. We respectfully urge you to do so. Rainbow Push Coalition welcomes the opportunity to serve as a place for Jussie to resume his desire to serve the community. During the first year of COVID, we served more than 4,000 meals each day. We have a program that is designed to meet some of the issues homeless individuals face each and every day in the city while trying to survive. We believe that those who are impacted by the criminal justice system deserve an opportunity to be restored to a meaningful life and lives throughout community engagement and public service. We have worked diligently to transform the lives of young people in our Push Excel programs. I believe that Jussie has much to give to America, and this case is a stumbling block that should not become a setback to his future. We do not want Jussie to become another prison statistic, as he has way too much to offer. I stand ready, along with the board of directors and the several thousand members of the Rainbow Push Coalition, to support Jussie Smollett in his journey to wholeness. We want to assist this court in meting out justice for Jussie Smollett. Signed, the Reverend Jesse L. Jackson, Sr.
Any other submissions? Ms. Flanagan?
Your Honor, I have a letter from Lauren Caseburg on behalf of the Illinois Innocence Project. To the Honorable Judge Lynn, I submit this letter in my personal capacity as co-director of the Illinois Innocence Project. This letter is provided in support of a non-custodial sentence for Jussie Smollett, and also to inform the court that if there is a community service component to Mr. Smollett's sentence, he would be welcome to do so under my direct supervision at the Illinois Innocence Project. At the outset, I want to be clear that the jury found Mr. Smollett guilty, and I respect the jury's verdict. I write to you today regarding his sentence and urge the court to issue a just and fair sentence to Mr. Smollett. In high-profile cases, there is often a tone surrounding a case that seems to call for the harshest possible punishment because of the attention the case has garnered. I would urge Your Honor to silence out those loud voices and see Mr. Smollett for who he is, as a person before you, a human being. The old adage applies here: justice is the law tempered by mercy. Here, while the law may permit you to sentence Mr. Smollett to prison, incarcerating him would not be just. The relentless media coverage of this case is a unique punishment in and of itself for Mr. Smollett. He will carry the stain of this case for the rest of his life and spend the rest of his life and career working to rebuild and establish his credibility, his reputation, and good name. That lifetime sentence is something this court should consider as a unique punishment already dealt to Mr. Smollett in the court of public opinion. In fact, cases with media attention provide an opportunity for the court to show the public that justice, fairness, and mercy applies to everyone, no matter who they are. If the system doesn't treat a high-profile defendant justly, then what can be expected for the rest of us? If Mr. Smollett, who has no prior felony convictions and no violent background, is sent to prison on a Class 4 conviction, then what does that mean for an unknown defendant who has no one watching or advocating for him? This, of course, intersects with the disparate manner in which people of color are sentenced, with Black men receiving the most disproportionately high sentences. During a time in which leaders around our state have put a focus on lessening the incarceration rates in Illinois prisons for justice-related reasons as well as due to COVID-19, there is no justifiable purpose to send Mr. Smollett to prison on a Class 4 conviction. This is especially true when Mr. Smollett could receive a non-custodial sentence, which includes community service where he could do good. Mr. Smollett has a long history of philanthropy which predates this case. As the well-known attorney and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, Brian Stevenson, has said, each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. Mr. Smollett is no exception. Not only is Mr. Smollett more than the case before you, he has the opportunity to give back to the world in a positive way. At the Illinois Innocence Project, in the course of fulfilling our mission of advocacy, education, and reform, we regularly work with volunteers in a variety of areas. Since 2001, the Illinois Innocence Project has had a robust volunteer program, working successfully with volunteers of various backgrounds who have engaged in work ranging from file organization to case evaluations to office support and more. We have found that volunteers working with us gain a close-up view of the brutal injustices faced by our clients who are all serving decades-long or life sentences for crimes in which they are actually innocent. This up-close view of the trauma inflicted upon these individuals and their loved ones is an awakening and often life-changing experience for our volunteers and staff. In my 9 years working at the Illinois Innocence Project and my 15 years as an attorney working in criminal defense, I have seen the cruelty and dehumanization of prison, as well as how prison impacts people in negative ways. Every person I've ever known who spent time in prison left with increased mental health needs and post-traumatic stress disorder. Incarceration should be reserved for crimes of violence and dangerous individuals, not for someone in Mr. Smollett's position who has no prior felony convictions, no violence in his past, is convicted of a probationable Class 4 offense, and who has much good to still offer this world. Prison time should not be given to satiate the public's calls for retribution. If this court sentences Mr. Smollett to probation with a component of community service, I will make myself available to the court and will comply with any orders of the court related to supervision, timekeeping, and project updates if Mr. Smollett were to have the opportunity to work with our organization. Thank you for your consideration. Sincerely, Lauren Caseberg.
Ms. Walker.
Thank you.
These are the last.
So with the court's indulgence, I have 2 letters. The first is from Oscar-nominated winner of 4 Primetime Emmys and 2 Grammys and political activist, Alfre Woodard. Dear Judge Lynn, I hope you and your loved ones are well and are finding a way forward in this time. I am writing to you today as someone who is more than a friend to Jussie Smollett. I am in my 60th decade. And when he was a young teen, as we worked, and we met when he was a young teen, as we worked together to bring shelter, health, and education to South Africa's AIDS orphans. Jussie referred to me as Mama Alfre. It is out of that bond that I make this appeal to you. Jussie was convicted of a Class 4 felony. I know it to be the least severe category of felonies in Illinois. I also have learned it is a well-established practice in your county, as well as around the country, to sentence Class 4 disorderly conduct cases to alternatives to incarceration, including second chance probation, or deferred prosecution. I respect that an important aspect a trial judge must consider when sentencing someone is the potential for recidivism. Jussie's lack of a felony criminal record, as well as his many years of humanitarian work on behalf of communities in need, is a strong signal that he carries no risk of recidivism. For years, I have been at his side as he's lit up rooms full of elders, men and women battling and living with HIV and AIDS, and playgrounds where the children of those who lost the battle reach for the kind of joy that Jussie brings. Now, some conscientious people reach out to those without access after they achieve success in their given fields. Jussie has been a compassionate presence and advocate for those without means since he was a boy. His dedicated work as an artist brought him success and allowed him to bring his natural impulse to be of assistance to an even wider field of effectiveness. Jussie has kept his heart, his wallet, and his schedule wide open to those suffering among us. Judge Lynn, I know you and I are meeting, quote unquote, in a situation that would cause some, quote unquote, mamas to lower their eyes. But I must tell you, I am proud of this man, who I have known to be an exceptionally kind human being. It is an honor to write you on his behalf because I get to sit and think on Jussie this afternoon. It brings up wonderful thoughts. My dear friend Jussie Smollett has been convicted of a nonviolent crime. He never has been, and certainly is not now, a public safety risk. He has carried himself with dignity and self-control throughout this process of the last few years. He has delved deeper spiritually in self-realization to come through a vicious public excoriation that would have crushed or inflamed lesser men. The punishing has been relentless and has left nothing to be taken away. He has already paid a professional and personal price that few in real power have even for crimes against the health and safety of millions. Through it all, Jussie has stood like the good man I know him to be. Bottom line, if he is incarcerated, I fear for his safety. I fear for his safety. Judge Lynn, I've heard you characterized as a fair man. It is your fairness and your discernment that my hope is relying upon in this matter. You hold the keys to the freedom and the future of a great giver, Jussie Smollett, to keep his commitment of bringing joy and hope to people whose everydays depend on that healing. I beg your leniency. Sincerely, Alfred Woodard. So the last letter is from Derek Johnson, who is the president and chief executive officer of the NAACP. Dear Judge Lynn, I write today in my capacity as president and CEO of the NAACP. Formed in 1909, the NAACP is the oldest and largest civil rights organization in the United States. In this nation, Black people are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of whites and frequently receive disparate sentencing. In Illinois, Black defendants convicted of a felony were more likely than white defendants to be sentenced to prison at a 57% and 39% rate, respectively. A mainstay of our organization continues to be advocacy for fair treatment of persons of color by the criminal justice system. This brings us to the subject of the upcoming sentencing of Jussie Smollett. It would be an understatement to say that an inordinate amount of attention has been given to Mr. Smollett's case. This case involves no drugs, no theft, no sex, no property damage, and no physical injury to anyone other than the defendant. Despite the attention paid to it by the media, at its heart, this case involves a low-level, nonviolent offense. We urge the court to keep this truth in mind when sentencing Mr. Smollett. By way of background, Mr. Smollett has an extensive history in civil rights advocacy and philanthropy. Mr. Smollett personally donated more than $500,000 to Black organizations and gave $125,000 in proceeds from his music tour to organizations including the organizations working for Black, LGBTQ+, and women's rights, including the Black AIDS Institute, which provides high-quality, direct HIV services to Black people, the Flint Kids Fund, which funds programs aimed to address and mitigate the impact of lead poisoning and the trauma suffered by children in Flint, Michigan, the Trayvon Martin Foundation, whose main purpose is to provide emotional and financial support to families who have lost a child to gun violence, the Know Your Rights Camp, whose mission is to advance the liberation and well-being of Black and brown communities through education, self-empowerment, mass mobilization, and the creation of new systems that elevate the next generation of change leaders. In 2018, Mr. Smollett surprised a 6-year-old double amputee with a wheelchair accessible van after learning that the child's school district did not own such a vehicle. Mr. Smollett has been a recognized supporter of the Human Rights Campaign, a civil rights organization that strives to end discrimination against LGBTQ+ people and realize a world that achieves fundamental fairness and equality for all. Lest there be an argument that such donations and activities were made as a part of any PR damage control, such acts all preceded the 2019 events that resulted in charges being brought against Mr. Smollett. In 2018, after learning that Bennett College, an all-women's HBCU, which stands for Historically Black College and University, was on the brink of losing its accreditation, Mr. Smollett and his brother helped the institute raise the funds needed to retain accreditation. In fact, the college needed only $5 million. Mr. Smollett and his brother led a campaign that was so successful it raised $8 million. Mr. Smollett's civil rights work began when he was a child who served as an NAACP youth volunteer. In 2016, Mr. Smollett won the Chairman's Award at the NAACP Image Awards. The Chairman's Award is given in recognition of individuals who have committed themselves to acts of public service while using their platforms to create effective change. In short, Mr. Smollett has demonstrated a long-standing commitment to helping others. We believe that incarcerating Mr. Smollett would be solely punitive and would serve no purpose. As this court may know, in 2015, Illinois Governor Bruce Rauner created a criminal justice task force to identify areas of the criminal justice system that could be reformed that would result in a 25% reduction in the prison population by 2025. One such proposal for reform was reducing the incarceration rate of persons convicted of Class 4 nonviolent felonies. This is precisely the type of offense of which Mr. Smollett was convicted. Finally, Mr. Smollett does not pose, nor has he ever posed, a threat to anyone. Thus, we respectfully ask, assuming this court is inclined to sentence Mr. Smollett to anything other than a monetary fine or a suspended sentence, that the court sentence Mr. Smollett to probation and mandatory community service. Respectfully submitted, Derek Johnson, President and CEO of NAACP. Thank you. Thank you, Judge, for your time.
Okay, we wish to publish no further letters, Your Honor. We incorporate the other letters into the record.
They will be incorporated. No further letters. I'm ready to keep going. The lawyers need a break. Are you ready to go? Maybe we have a short break. Yeah, sure you can. Yes. Very short. 5 minutes. 5-minute recess.
All right, ladies and gentlemen. So how do you guys feel about it? I feel like it's a lot going on. Let's stay tuned.
Out close games, riding a 15-game winning streak to state after some early season struggles.
It hasn't been always the easy route. We've lost a couple games, so definitely that has made us build character.
It's a double dose of history here at Barrington High School. A week after the girls made their first trip to state, it's the boys' turn to make their first appearance in the Final Four.
Honestly, it's unheard of, you know, girls and boys making it to the state the same year. I think Bolingbrook did that this year as well, so props to them. But you know, it's honestly it's surreal. You know, it's teachers and friends have been telling me this is once in a lifetime opportunity.
And based on the teams they've already knocked off, this group believes they can get it done in Champaign. In Barrington, Matt Zahn, CBS 2 News.
And while baseball and football are trying to steal the limelight, this weekend will certainly be all about basketball, state championships, conference tournaments, and of course, March Madness right around the corner. Can't wait for that.
Yeah. Jackie, thank you.
Well, what would you do if you saw adult content on Facebook?
and I was just scrolling through Facebook like most normal people would be doing.
And tell me what you saw.
A local man says he wanted to warn his friends. Instead, he found himself in Facebook jail. And a live look at travel times right now. Looks like Kenny's getting a little jammed up for your Thursday commute.
You're just one tap away from the latest breaking news. Download the CBS Chicago app.
Try CBS 2 News.
Our whole team works to break news around the clock so you know what's happening right now.
And First Alert Weather warns you sooner, keeps you safer, and gives you weather information you need for every hour of the day.
And that's why we believe in making a difference here in our community. That's why we're always investigating,
Trying to find solutions.
absolutely,
That change laws and change lives.
So watch us wherever you get your news and see CBS 2 News.
The good news? You can watch every episode of TV's #1 new comedy. The other news?
Oh, Ma!
Some seem to be taking it a bit far.
You're creeping nuts.
Ghosts, now available on Paramount Plus.
CBS News Chicago, your local news, is streaming now. The CBS 2 investigators, they go after injustice. If you've been wronged, call 312-899-2250 or email cbs2investigators@cbs.com. The CBS 2 investigators, they get results. CBS News Chicago, your local news from the team you trust.
We will continue to follow that breaking news.
Wherever, whenever, on the CBS News app and on Pluto TV.
What's that for?
Not sure, but I'd sure hate you don't have it when we find out.
This journey will be dangerous all the way to Oregon. You can police yourselves, or I can do it.
New series now streaming exclusively on Paramount Plus.
First Alert Weather is our promise to be the first to let you know about any change in our weather. That's everyday weather that can change your plans and severe weather that can change your life. It's our commitment to keep you better informed around the clock so you can stay ahead of the weather any time of the day. Simply put, First Alert Weather will help you plan and prepare sooner so you can be safer. It's a better, more accurate forecast for you. That's what it's all about. First Alert Weather is a commitment. It's a promise. It's what we do every day for you.
Keep streaming CBS News Chicago on the CBS News app and on Pluto TV.
Try CBS 2 News.
Our whole team works to break news around the clock so you know what's happening right now.
And First Alert Weather warns you sooner, keeps you safer, and gives you weather information you need for every hour of the day.
and that's why we believe in making a difference here in our community. That's why we're always investigating,
Trying to find solutions.
absolutely,
That change laws and change lives.
So watch us wherever you get your news and see CBS 2 News.
You're just one tap away from the latest breaking news. Download the CBS Chicago app.
Try CBS 2 News.
Our whole team works to break news around the clock so you know what's happening right now.
And First Alert Weather warns you sooner, keeps you safer, and gives you weather information you need for every hour of the day.
and that's why we believe in making a difference here in our community. That's why we're always investigating,
Trying to find solutions.
absolutely,
That change laws and change lives.
So watch us wherever you get your news and see CBS 2 News.
The good news? You can watch every episode of new comedy. The other.
Guessing Ms. Duce wants to be here. Okay, thank you, everyone. Ms. Webb, I will hear from the Office of Special Prosecutor, arguments and aggravation.
Thank you, Your Honor. As Your Honor knows, this is the sentencing phase of the case where we, from the Special Prosecutor's Office, get a chance to kind of sit back and reflect with the court for a bit and talk about whether there are aggravating special circumstances in this case that we want to call to your Honor's attention, so you can consider or focus on them if you choose to, in rendering sentence in this case. There are three. There's three I want to talk about. Number one, I do want to talk about the underlying serious criminal misconduct that Mr. Smollett engaged in and that he was convicted of by a jury after they heard all the evidence, and they, the jury, made the decision that he was guilty of 5 felony offenses. I want to talk about that. We've heard a lot about that in this sentencing hearing, a lot of talk about how it's kind of a low-level thing, not a big deal. I want to talk about it. Number two, another aggravating circumstance that I think is a big issue is that during this trial, Mr. Smollett made the choice, sitting here in front of a jury, listening to evidence, he decided to beat the case and go in front of a jury and take an oath to tell the truth and decide to lie to them, and lie to them for several hours. It was an effort to obstruct justice in this courtroom, to try to convince a jury to ignore evidence and accept his lies, and they didn't do it. They rejected it all. And after 2 or 3 hours of deliberation, found him guilty of 5 counts. So I want to talk about that. The third is the issue of contrition. As far as I know, as I stand before your Honor, in the 3 years that this case has been pending, 3 years, Mr. Smollett has never made any statement publicly or in a courtroom or in a court pleading to ever accept any acknowledgement that he's responsible for what happened here, to admit that he in fact engaged in wrongdoing, to apologize for making mistakes. None of that has happened. Not a single act of contrition has happened so far in this case, and I at least want to talk about that as a third factor. Let me go through them one at a time. On the first one, on the seriousness of misconduct, I know we've heard a lot about this and it's a low-level offense, but I want to talk about it in a minute, because what I believe, if you look at the evidence that was introduced during the trial, what you see is that Mr. Smollett actually engaged in a very well thought out plan, a calculated plan for him to fake a hate crime to benefit himself because he's black and gay. He made the choice. He didn't want to fake an automobile accident. He made a choice. He wanted to fake a hate crime to benefit himself because he's black and gay. And he then made a choice. He made the choice to falsely report it to the Chicago Police Department because he wanted public attention to it. The only reason the brothers had nothing to do with that decision, that was Mr. Smollett's decision. He actually wanted public attention, called to the fact that he was reporting a hate crime. He wanted it to be made public, and that's why he reported it to the Chicago Police Department. He's the one that made that choice. Remember, he actually, when he planned out the fake attack, he wanted it to be put on a camera. There was a police camera overhead near his apartment building. He wanted that filmed. In fact, that's why he told the brothers where to do the attack, because he's the one that wanted a great deal of public attention, called to this because he thought he would benefit from it. And then he made the decision. It wasn't like he sat down with a policeman for 10 minutes. You've heard 5 different police officers testify in detail. He spent hours talking to police officers, going through details that were all false, to convince them that there really was a real hate crime. And he lied to them over and over and over again. And the idea that lying to law enforcement, taking their attention away from other crimes and criminal activity in order to benefit himself, is some type of low-level, insignificant activity. I respectfully reject that as not being consistent with the evidence. And respectfully, to what I heard from others here today, there were consequences to others of what he did. And that's something the court is allowed to take into consideration. What Mr. Smollett did in this case is he denigrated degraded true hate crimes, and he marginalized the people who are true victims of hate crimes. That is what he did. And he did that knowingly. He knew exactly what was going to happen. He didn't know he was going to get caught, but by what he did here, he's the one that made a choice that resulted in true hate crimes being denigrated, degraded, and true victims being marginalized. We know, in fact, it's in the Chicago Police Department report, that the hate crime victims of hate crimes are frequently minorities, whether it's based on race, religion, or sexual orientation. And studies show that that group of people are reluctant to report criminal activity to police, hate crimes to the police. And that was discussed in the Chicago Police Department report. There are studies that support that. It takes a tremendous amount of courage on behalf of someone who's been truly victimized of a hate crime to have the courage to come forward, to go through the process of reporting it, to go through our criminal justice system as a witness. It takes courage. And what Mr. Smollett did in this case clearly would have a marginalized, discouraging influence. It hurt the effort to have people come forward and report hate crimes. And that was wrong. That is serious misconduct and a serious consequence of what he did. And he did it in 2019. And if I want to go back to that time period, that's a time period where there was a lot of racial tension, divisiveness. Hate crimes were becoming far too common, and police were accused of not paying enough attention to it. And that society was trying to find a way, at least this is my view, of trying to find a way to make it clear that that needs to be reported. Hate crime needs to be addressed by law enforcement machinery in this country. And what he did, what Mr. Smollett did, to marginalize that, to discourage people from coming forward, I respectfully suggest is wrong. And that, and it was a normal consequence of what he did in order to benefit himself. Remember what the facts are. He made the choice in January of 2019 he felt that Empire was not paying enough attention to a hate letter about him that came to him, and he wasn't getting enough attention. And he decided to fake a hate crime to benefit himself. He wanted to benefit himself. That's why he did it. And he hatched the plan. And Your Honor, he did it all. Nobody else did any of this. And I know you know the facts, but he did it all. He planned everything out at that time. He recruited the brothers. He went forward with this plan. And even to the point of trying to work out where they would actually do a dry run so that the brothers would know exactly where to do the attack at. All of that. He told them what to buy, what derogatory, homophobic, racial slurs to utter, to try to pretend as if there's whites involved by yelling out mega country. He owned every bit of the plan, and he worked hard on it. He planned it out, and he executed on it, and he owns that for doing that. And so, yes, it is serious misconduct on his part, and it had broad ramifications. And the true victims are, of course, number one, the true hate crime victims that are not going to report these crimes. They are the true victims. The police department, though, is a victim, and I'm going to talk about that because sometimes the Chicago Police Department gets criticized for not doing things the way maybe people think it should be done. I'm not here to defend the Chicago Police Department, but I'm telling you, in this case, this Chicago Police Department shined. When this, and then we hear in this courtroom, the police department paid too much attention to it. They shouldn't have they shouldn't have spent so many hours investigating this misconduct. And they argued last night in the filing with Your Honor, they argued, well, we shouldn't have to pay restitution for all that because the police department spent too much time on it. My Lord, I wonder what would have happened if Chicago Police Department took this hate crime, which on its face, by the way, is a heinous, serious awful hate crime. Awful. Ropes, lynchings, gasoline. It clearly called out for a thorough investigation, and that happened. And we put 5 police officers on the stand. They testified in great detail to the 4 different occasions when Mr. Smollett lied to them. They described in detail 3,000 police hours, Your Honor, were devoted to this case instead of being devoted maybe to solving homicides or other cases. And therefore, Your Honor, I believe that the effort of the Chicago Police Department here, and when you look at the evidence, the fact that this police department within, I think, 15 days figured out what happened here. I mean, if you remember, what they were able to do in this case, I think was truly amazing, because what they did is that they were able to locate some surveillance tapes of these 2 suspects being dropped off around 1:15 in the morning in the Streeterville area. They traced it all through that area of where the suspects went. They traced that cab back to where the Ossadero brothers got into it in the, I think around Wells and North, and they solved the crime. They figured out what happened here. And that the point of that is that, and by the way, they did it, Your Honor, they did that as an incredible effort on their part, when we now know from the evidence at trial, that Smollett, while he was reporting a hate crime, he actually was trying to obstruct the police. He didn't want the police to actually find out who the culprits were, because he was afraid they would turn on him and testify. So he refused to produce his phone. You heard all the evidence. He refused to produce it because there's 50 contacts on there with Abel Ossadero that he didn't want them to find. So he just refused to cooperate. Number 2, he refused to let the police look at his Northwestern medical records the day that he reported the crime, because he knew that he wasn't seriously injured, and that would not support his argument about the attack. So he refused to cooperate. And then he wouldn't even do a 3-second DNA swab when he had reported this, and reported that the rope may have the DNA on it of these culprits, but the police wanted to eliminate his DNA, and he wouldn't do it. So while he's reporting this, as far as you considering whether it's a serious crime or not, I respectfully suggest that the fact that he not only planned out to falsely report it, but then to obstruct the police investigation. And yes, the issue about whether it's serious, and I've heard a lot about, well, no one goes to jail. That's not true. Every case, Your Honor, if anyone knows better than you, each case is decided individually. But I did go out and do some research because I was curious about all this stuff I've been hearing that, well, no one goes to jail for this. That's just not true, by the way. There was, in fact, I think there's 6 cases in the last 5 years that we found in the research of people in Illinois going to jail for this very conduct of falsely reporting crimes to police. It is a serious course of criminal misconduct to do it. It's a felony. And I think there was one decided by appellate court 4 months ago, which involved reporting to the police that the person was hit by a police car when they weren't. I think what happened here was a lot worse than that, and that person got 14 months incarceration for filing a false police report. So yes, I do believe that this conduct is serious, and I respectfully suggest it's an important factor to consider. Aggravating factor number 2 is lying under oath. I'm not going to go through it. Your Honor heard the testimony. He made a choice. By the way, I'm a defense lawyer, Your Honor. Yes, we all get choices to be made, and defendants can make choices. But he made the choice. Mr. Smollett made the choice that he could deceive that jury and went on the stand and lied to them about so many different things. I'm not even going to, I was going to summarize some of them, but I don't even want it. I don't need to. You heard what happened during the course of the trial. Testimony that he went out and at 2 o'clock in the morning to buy eggs from Walgreens. The Walgreens was not even a 24-hour Walgreens. It was a ridiculous story. The fact that one of the attackers is white and he didn't even know who attacked him was ridiculous. The fact that the brothers had no foreknowledge and just happened to stumble over there into a Streeterville that they didn't live in, and were happened to be there at 2 o'clock in the morning when he was out going through that in that stairwell. All of that were intentional lies. And by the way, people do not, that going in front of a jury and deciding to lie under oath to see if you can beat the case and obstruct justice is a serious course of criminal misconduct that I think should be taken into consideration. I also will tell Your Honor that the issue of lack of contrition here, I do think is an important issue, and Your Honor can decide how much to give to that. But the reason I went and did some research on this, Your Honor, because I wanted to make sure I was handling this issue properly before Your Honor. And so I went and did some research. And the Illinois Supreme Court has made a big deal out of the fact that sentencing judges absolutely can consider that someone has shown no contrition whatsoever, particularly after they have been convicted of a crime. Now, it may be, it could be here when I'm done talking, Mr. Smollett will speak to the court and explain how he's accepting full responsibility for his criminal misconduct. He may do that. That's fine. Let's see if that happens. But at least at this point, that has not happened. And there's an Illinois Supreme Court opinion called People versus Ward, in which I'm going to quote, the Supreme Court told sentencing judges a continued protestation of innocence and a lack of remorse may convey a strong message to the trial judge that the defendant is an unmitigated liar and at continued war with society. That's the quote from the Illinois Supreme Court. So I do think it's at least a factor for Your Honor to consider during the course of your decision-making here. So let's go through the different issues of sentencing and just talk about them briefly. Term of imprisonment, yes. We are recommending to Your Honor that the seriousness of this crime should result in a period of incarceration for all the reasons I've just articulated to you. As you know, that each of the counts, the felony counts, 3 years times 5, he faces 15 years maximum in jail. And Your Honor knows that Illinois law provides that you have the power to impose a term of imprisonment if you find that probation would deprecate the seriousness of the offender's conduct and would be inconsistent with the ends of justice. I'm not going to suggest any amount of time, because if there was ever a judge that had the ability to understand what to use discretion, whatever you decide is let me just say this, your ability to decide based on all your years of experience and your years on the bench, we accept that, and whatever you decide on that issue, you decide that. But we do believe that it is a serious criminal misconduct that warrants an appropriate amount of prison time. Number 2, restitution. The Illinois restitution statute covers class 4 felonies and says that you shall determine whether the defendant should be required to make restitution in cash for out-of-pocket expenses. You've heard the evidence. It's $130,000, $130,106. And on that issue, Your Honor, we believe that's the appropriate amount of restitution to order. Now, I will say that first Smollett case, which led to a $10,000, it's called a forfeiture in the record, okay? It was some kind of forfeiture to the city of Chicago. It was not restitution. The city of Chicago was not trying to get, that was done by the state's attorney's office with no agreement by the city of Chicago, but he did pay it, okay? So at least our thought is that would be deducted, that the order for restitution would be $130,000. That's the right order, but he does get a credit for that because he did pay it under, let's call it confusing and this unusual circumstances that I've talked about in another report. I'm not going to talk about here. Probation. As Your Honor knows, under Illinois law for a class 4 felony, you can impose a period of probation not to exceed 30 months, but you cannot impose both a term of imprisonment and a term of probation on the same class 4 felony convictions under the case law. So that our recommendation to Your Honor is that you have the authority to impose imprisonment on one of the counts that he was convicted of, one of the 5 counts he was convicted of, and then on one of the other 4 or more than the other, you can impose a consecutive term of probation to follow. Now, why do I talk about that? Okay, why should that be? Because he's not a violent crime, etc. Your Honor, in 2007, Mr. Smollett had a prior conviction in 2007 in connection with a DUI arrest in California for providing false information to a police officer. Mr. Smollett reflects that this case today is not the first time he had lied to law enforcement officials. And so I believe as a result, the Office of Special Prosecutor believes that an appropriate term of probation, whatever you decide in Your Honor's discretion, should follow an imprisonment term. Next, criminal fines. Again, this is in Your Honor's discretion. You can decide the maximum is $25,000 for 5 counts. That would be $125,000 for each, for the totality. We recommend a reasonable criminal fine to be imposed by Your Honor based on your judgment about it. Community service. Let's talk about community service because there's been, the defense has asked that maybe you should consider community service, and we agree with that, but it should be a condition of probation following a term of time in jail and following a term of probation. But as part of the probation, you have the authority, as Your Honor knows, to perform, he can be ordered to perform 30 to 120 hours of community service as a condition of probation under Illinois law. We respectfully ask Your Honor to impose and to at least consider maybe it should be devoted to an appropriate Black or gay community service organization that can benefit from Mr. Smollett's hours of community service. And so, Your Honor, I'm going to conclude. You know the case very well. I was appointed as special prosecutor, as Your Honor's already pointed out here today, because Judge Tooman, after looking at the unusual way that Smollett 1 was resolved by the state's attorney's office, when the case was dismissed completely with absolutely no term of imprisonment, no criminal fine, no restitution, no probation, no supervision, nothing. That Judge Tooman found that to be what he described as to be a significant mistakes by the state's attorney's office, and he believed that the public's confidence in the criminal justice system should be restored. I will tell you, at least as a trial lawyer, I believe this trial in this case has already done that, I believe, okay? The public wanted Smollett to be put, not just have his case dismissed, but Mr. Smollett should be put on trial and let a jury hear the evidence and decide. You brought that to happen at the end, well, almost still in the middle of a pandemic, you made that happen. And absolutely, Mr. Smollett got a fair trial here. There are some ins out there, though, that relate to punishment. And I respectfully suggest that the confidence in the criminal justice system can be restored as a fair and proper sentence is imposed in this case. I have nothing else to say unless Your Honor has questions of me.
Thank you. I have no questions. I'll hear arguments of mitigation. Ms. Tucci.
Mr. Webb, Judge Lane, may it please the court. Judge, the defense is respectfully asking that you, as a starting point, consider the following: the extraordinary media publicity surrounding this case, the intense negative backlash against my client, Mr. Smollett, the significant negative impact that has had on his career, his livelihood, his family, who's been in court all the time, and perhaps more importantly, his reputation. All those things taken together in of themselves are not just extraordinary, are not just unique, but indeed eternal enough punishment. And some will argue more than enough punishment for a low-level class 4 felony in this state, and I dare say in any state in the union. I begin by quoting a judge. I am trying to treat this case more like other cases, not differently than other cases, but more like other cases. That was you, August 26, 2021. You made that statement to us while we're discussing jury selection and procedures. And so I begin by asking you to treat this case like any other low-level class 4 felony. Somehow this case has turned into a sheep in wolf's clothing, a misdemeanor dressed up as a felony, essentially. And how do I know this? Mr. Webb spent the entirety of his argument talking about the time wasted by the Chicago police force, time wasted by the city of Chicago. He also spent time talking about the impact this could have on the LGBTQ community. But there are problems with that, of course, Judge. Because I searched the disorderly conduct statute, the entire team did, and I was searching to see if there was any aggravation or enhancement ladder that our legislature in Springfield put in place for class 4 disorderly conduct. Did they meet during the discussion of the bill that they passed to say anytime anyone wastes more than $30,000 of resources, it becomes a class 2? Anytime anyone wastes more than $500,000 of resources, it becomes a class 1 or maybe a class X. No, it's not there. I searched for it. But what we do have is an enhancement ladder that does exist in the disorderly conduct statute, and it's right here. If you call falsely 911 or the police to claim that there's a bomb threat, any terrorism-related issue, you get a class 3, and that's the only enhancement ladder. And I trust that our legislature has the common sense to think about time wasting and money, but it's already infused in the class 4. That's the whole point of a class 4 disorderly conduct. Mr. Smollett is not being accused of screaming fire, fire, or bomb, 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 which will cause a public safety concern. That's why the legislature put that in there. Because they were thinking of a situation where someone comes into a movie theater, screams bomb, and there's a stampede and people could possibly die. So there's a public safety concern infused in that enhancement ladder. They did not think about money or time wasted because it's already in the statute, it's already accommodated for in the class 4 statute. And we know they think of these things when you look at the statute, the armed robbery statute. If you rob someone with a gun on top of the class X enhancement, what happens? You get 20 years added to your sentence. You rob someone with a gun and you discharge that gun causing great bodily harm, what happens to you? 25 to life, enhancement on top of the class X. Even down to your basic speeding laws. You're driving 26 miles per hour over, now class B misdemeanor. You're going 35 miles per hour, it's now a class A misdemeanor. The legislature thinks about this thing. Mr. Webb and OSP wants you to legislate law that doesn't exist in our statute, and that is not for the courts. The $130,000 they talk about, well, there are problems with it. We can't take it at face value. Judge, you have the victim impact statement in front of you. If you look at the first 2 pages, there are no dates on that. If you look at the second 2 pages, highlighted are entries with dates, and only 4 of those entries are before February 15, 2019. Why is that important? It's important because on February 15, 2019, the Oshundaya brothers, according to testimony, confessed allegedly to this incident. And that was the day detectives let them go and began the investigation on Mr. Smollett. So why do we now have charges, most of which are after 2/15? Judge, the second point I'll make is we're asking you to adopt the previous sanctions. Mr. Webb tries to dress it up like a forfeiture, call it what you want. Mr. Smollett was fined $10,000. Black Laws Dictionary, that's a fine. You can't punish a person twice. And I know you've denied the motion, that's fine, but that's not why I'm bringing it up. Because there is an Eighth Amendment issue here, cruel and unusual punishment. Punishment that is too severe for the offense. And how do we know this is too severe? Assume, or the jury found him guilty, okay. But Smollett won. To 2019, they made him pay what? $10,000 fine, which has never been returned to him. The sovereign of the state of Illinois, through their agent, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, said, Mr. Smollett, we're taking your $10,000 bond, we're giving it to the city of Chicago. Bye-bye. He's never seen it. That is a fine. Then they made him do community service, which he cannot undo unless we had a time machine. So those two things are punishments that has been meted out to him. Sanctionable steps. And now Mr. Webb has come here to ask you on top of those two things, which he cannot undo, nor can anyone. You can deduct it all you want from the fines or the restitution. It's still a fine that occurred. They're now asking you on top of those two things, we want you to give him community service and jail time. He doesn't say how much jail time, and jail time. And by the way, while you're at it, for the restitution that has no dates on the first 2 pages and the other 2 pages, there are only 4 after 215. We want you to give him that too, $130,000. It's overkill. It's called beating a dead horse. And that is not justice. That's retribution. That's punitive. And that has no place in the judicial system. Why should Mr. Smollett get probation? You've heard from the witnesses. I'm not going to rehash the testimony. And you specifically heard during the trial from someone who was in here today, Pamela Sharp. She talked about how Jussie gave most of his payments, his earnings, his salaries to charity. How many people do that? I haven't done it. But maybe I've learned something from Mr. Smollett. How many people at the age of 16 were taking a bus to go do community service and charitable foundation work for other people in other countries that weren't even here? How many people do that? Most kids at 16 are playing video games. I did. And that's the type of person we want to crucify for a class 4 low-level misdemeanor type felony and slam him in jail. That's what we do to people like that. When according to the jury, they made a mistake. Lock him up. There's no violent crime, no felony that is above a class 4 alleged. He has no felony conviction in his record. Mr. Webb brings up the DUI, but conveniently left out the fact that it was a misdemeanor. And he was drunk. When people are drunk, they say silly stuff. Let's not forget that. And he was 24 years old. He was a young man. If Your Honor doesn't seem to, if Your Honor is somehow, and I don't know what's in Your Honor's mind, thinking, Mr. Uche, that's just you as defense attorney. Of course you're going to ask for probation. Well, the adult probation department here in this building that has been around forever gave you a probation report, Judge. And what did they rank Mr. Smollett using the Ohio risk scale assessment? They ranked him a 7. And when you compare that to the scoring system, 0 to 14 is considered low risk. So Mr. Smollett is not just low, but he's low within the low risk standard. 15 to 23, moderate risk. 24 to 33, high risk. 34 plus, very high. What do they recommend for a low risk individual? Minimal supervision, non-monitoring supervision. That's what they told you. Point 4, There is extraordinary public policy. Mr. Webb got up here and talked about Mr. Smollett's conduct, and that's offensive. He's a black man. He knows. You can't educate him on racism issues. And Mr. Webb got up here and said, well, Mr. Smollett, what he's done, because remember, they're trying to give you an enhancement that doesn't exist. What he has done, Judge Lynn, this is what Mr. Webb is telling you, is he's now negatively impacted members of the gay community who would not want to report. Where are the statistics? Who said that? We still haven't got past the part that his case was dismissed and he paid a fine. And that's some serious constitutional issues. But what we do know statistically, in an era of partisan tribalism and hyper-aggressive tribalism, political tribalism, there has been bipartisan agreement that there's disparate treatment of black men and minorities in the criminal justice system. This is no longer a controversial topic. President Trump, a Republican, pushed forward the First Step Act. President Obama was known for his criminal justice reform. Governor Bruce Rauner put reform forward to remove low-level Class 4 nonviolent offenders from custody. And Your Honor, we have to look at stare decisis, precedents in this courtroom. Your Honor has had multiple Class 4s, and I listed them in what I turned over to you. Some including some level of violence, domestic violence case number 19 CR 0139401. With a prior, he got 2 years probation for Class 4. And I'm sure Your Honor has absolutely every reason to have given that. DUI, serious offense, involving public safety, 24 months probation, case number 21 CR 0059101. And I list a bunch of cases, 6 more, Class 4 felonies. And I bring this up to say, Your Honor has absolutely always been on the right track. And I do not mean to be condescending. I hope I don't come off as that. But this is an important issue. You heard from Tamara when she read the NAACP letter, the Black Lives Matter letter, and the Innocence Project letter. And they all say that there's disparate treatment of black men in the criminal justice system. They get punished harder and harsher for low-level offenses compared to white counterparts. That's a fact. Mr. Webb was appointed special prosecutor almost a decade ago in a case involving involuntary manslaughter. That's why I was surprised he was asking for jail time, because that individual, what did they get? 30 months probation, including 60 days in their house, home confinement, for an involuntary manslaughter where someone died. And I showed the statistics, Judge. I put it in the filing that I made. The irony of this entire thing, when Mr. Webb gets up to point out that Mr. Smollett disrespected somehow the black community or the gay community, the irony of this situation, and Mr. Webb quotes statistics that he believes show that people are punished and false reporting. Well, most black men and most black people are falsely accused all the time. And in an age of social media, we're inundated with reports about this. And what happens to those things? They go unprosecuted, underprosecuted, and not prosecuted at all. So why are we jumping up and down and acting like this is a murder case? It's not. Even one of Mr. Smollett's jurors gets the big picture. This unknown juror spoke to the Chicago Sun-Times a day after the verdict. What did they say in quotes? "We didn't know what the penalty will be. Are we sending this guy to jail?" she said. The juror said she hopes Smollett gets probation. They were the ones that sat down through the evidence, and even her gets the picture, or he, whoever this juror is. They get it. What does jail accomplish? Mr. Webb is asking for incarceration for a low-level class 4 felony, well, Your Honor saw the submission from a medical affidavit. The jails are inundated with a pandemic. Illinois had one of the worst cases in the world. Sending Mr. Smollett to jail is almost like a death sentence. Yes, it is. Because anything medically can go wrong. And everyone reacts to the COVID-19 infection differently. Now, he hasn't gotten it yet, thank God, but I don't know what will happen in the jail, where I showed you studies show, unfortunately, the guards in the jail, unfortunately for them, and it's wrong, are always the last to get medical treatment, including booster shots, which as of January, they haven't even received. So we send Mr. Smollett to jail, he dies of COVID, and what, for a class 4 low-level offense? Mr. Smollett is a high-profile individual. There has been negative backlash against Mr. Smollett. I'm not complaining. We're the defense team. It comes to the territory. Each and every one of the defense lawyers has received racist or sexist attacks after this case and during this case. And that's okay. We take it. We're defense attorneys. That's what we do. So now imagine the attacks that Mr. Smollett has to live with for the rest of his life. That is punishment enough, mentally. The last point I'll make is public policy. There's public policy against retribution. Politics has no place in a courtroom. The courtroom is a graveyard for politics. And they can get up here and say the pride of Chicago was offended. That's fine. And time and money was wasted. And I heard Mr. Webb state to this court something I couldn't really decipher during the trial, that Mr. Webb did it for himself. The problem with that is we've all heard testimony from multiple people who say that Mr. Smollett does things for the community. Moreover, let's not forget, everyone testified unimpeached on their side, or on our side too, in terms of this particular issue. Mr. Webb, in terms of deciding or trying to figure out what drove Mr. Smollett to do this, started off by saying he wanted more money, then it became attention, then it became because of the letter he received. They haven't even up until now stuck to one issue. So I push back on that theory that Mr. Webb states to this court that Mr. Smollett did this because he was somehow benefiting himself. There was never a clear picture coming out of that for that. Judge, we ask you, at the end of the day, you are the one who decides the sentence of Mr. Smollett. But we ask you to decide it based on the law, not on the time wasted, not on a sprawling investigation. It's not here in our law. It's not accounted for. And there are many things you can do to make this a teaching moment. Here's someone that is a star. He's well known. People like him. After this case, or during this case, I doubt that anymore. But at the time, he has suffered. And we see it every day as a defense team. He has suffered, and it's enough. It's really enough. And I'm not asking you, Jan, I'm not in front of you, and I've appeared in front of you on other cases. I'm not here telling you, Judge Lynn, give him a break, let him just walk out and forget about this. I haven't asked for that. I haven't told you to dismiss this case right now in this argument. But I do implore you, and I ask you respectfully to focus on the law and to tamper justice with mercy. We've all made mistakes, Judge, in this life, and I'm speaking from your point of view. There was a conviction in this case. But what I'll leave you with, he that is without sin among you, let him cast the first stone. Everyone, a lot of people jumping around on social media, crucify him, how dare him. Everyone's made mistakes. And so, Judge, I'll be asking you to follow your precedent and follow, some of the recommendations. A lot of organizations offering to supervise Mr. Smollett. And that's really the way it should be. People are watching this case. Minorities, Black people. I've gotten so many letters. A letter Mr. Allen and I got yesterday from a lady complaining, how is a police officer who shoots a young man 16 times getting out of jail for 3 years, and someone might be suggesting incarceration for Mr. Smollett? That's a letter we got. So people are watching because people think in the Black community that there is a double standard, and there is. But Your Honor has been one of the few people in the United States in terms of dispensing justice that has stuck to the letter of the law and has treated class 4 felonies the way they ought to be treated. And so, Judge, with that, I submit my client to your hands, and I ask you for mercy at this time, and I ask you not to allow a political stoking to influence your decision, which I know you will never. And I ask you to focus on the law and the fact that there is no enhancement ladder for time wasting and resource wasted. And so, Judge, one more thing I would say, Mr. Webb talked about the restitution. Now, Your Honor has the power to give restitution, and we concede that point at this time. But, Judge, what I will remind you is if Mr. Smollett has to pay that amount or any amount Your Honor deems fit, he's lost nearly everything. He's had a very negative, significant impact on his career and his finances. So I would just ask that if Your Honor is going to give him that restitution order, you give him some time to pay that. And I was shocked Mr. Webb was asking for incarceration because for a second, I wrote out my notes thinking he was going to ask for some sort of suspended jail time, which will in a way be a middle ground. I disagree with it. To say, Judge, maybe you give him a suspended jail time to allow him to pay. If he doesn't pay the fine within 6 months, he gets 6 months in jail. I thought that's what Mr. Webb was going to say, but of course I'm not the prosecution. So Judge, I would ask you respectfully to give Mr. Smollett probation. And in fact, I would be asking for no fines based on the fact that he's been fined before. Thank you, Judge Lee. Thank you for listening to me.
Mr. Smollett, you're about to be sentenced in this criminal case. Is there anything at all you'd like to say to anyone? Want a break? We'll take a break. 5-minute recess.
You've been listening in to the sentencing hearing for Jussie Smollett, and the judge has now called a 5-minute recess. So in the meantime, we want to bring in our legal analyst, Irv Miller, who's been with us since noon when we started our coverage. So Irv, if you can hear me now. All right. So we've gotten to the point where we've heard from just about everyone. There's one main person that we haven't heard from yet. But the last person to speak here was Jussie Smollett's attorney, Lgbtqia. As you've been able to listen into some of the final speakers here, Dan Webb and Lgbtqia, what are your thoughts?
I'm very disappointed that Mr. Uche gave an argument that may give the judge some pause about what to do. If I were the defense attorney in this case, I would try to minimize the consequences for my client. The last thing in the world anybody wants is to be convicted of a felony. There's a provision in Illinois called second chance probation, which is probation, but it doesn't result in a conviction, and down the road it can be expungible. I would have been talking about second chance probation the entire closing argument, rather than talking about tempering justice with mercy. So I think Mr. Uche missed a great chance to try to ask for something that wouldn't harm his client for the rest of his life, but decided to roll the dice and see what's going to happen. Saying probation is different than asking for second chance probation.
So, Irv, where do we go from here? Because we've heard from so many of the Jussie Smollett's supporters through letters, of course, and then through his family members, his older brother, and then his grandmother, who spoke very pointedly to the judge about taking her to jail if he goes. So, what would you say are next steps?
Well, it's my understanding, and I could be wrong, but I think there was some statement at the very end that Mr. Smollett was not going to make a statement. If that's the case, then after this little break is over, the judge is going to come out and pronounce the sentence. Knowing Judge Lynn the way I do, he's not going to be talking for a long time, but he will give his reasons and he will impose the sentence, which I suspect will be probation. And the only question is whether or not there will be some Cook County jail time. Under Illinois law, he could give him up to 6 months in the county jail as a condition of probation. Also, he has the right to order that $130,000 of restitution to the city of Chicago. I think that would eliminate the federal case because he would have to pay it as a condition of probation. So my guess is he'll give him 2 years probation. He'll give him X amount of days in the Cook County jail, order restitution. I don't think he'll fine him like Mr. Webb requested, and he'll give him his appellate rights. And I think this case will be headed toward the appellate court.
So, Irv, my colleague, co-anchor Brad Edwards, back with us now. So we want to bring him into this conversation.
Yeah, just slipped out quickly. Irv, back. So what is your call then? How much time do you think Jussie Smollett then could go to jail for, which would be a short stay? Guesstimate the time, and then really by the time this thing is appealed, it will be moot. Jussie would have already served the time, right? Because if Jussie's going to go to jail, he's going to need a toothbrush tonight, right?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
If the judge sentences him to probation with X amount of days in the Cook County jail, he could take him into custody to serve that time. And whatever number the judge says, Mr. Smollett will only do half of that. The other thing is the judge could sentence him to the Cook County jail, but stay that pending any appeal or any particular amount of time. He doesn't have to impose it right away. He could say, I'm going to wait till 6 months from now and see how things are doing in the county jail with COVID, and we'll re-examine it at that time. That's a possibility.
So, Irv, I know when we were talking to you before we began our coverage, you were making the comment that this could be lengthy just because of the sheer number of people that would be speaking and the fact that they started by calling for a motion for a new trial. But here we are, you know, our coverage started at 12. The hearing commenced probably about 1:30. At 5:30, do you feel like this is right on time in terms of how this judge runs his courtroom and all the pieces of this falling into place?
Well, I'll tell you what really took a long period of time, which I didn't factor into my equation, was the judge allowing all these letters to be read in open court. These letters were submitted to the judge a couple days ago. He's read them. They were read in open court for the benefit of the media, not for the benefit of the judge. So that took a long period of time. And Erica, you're an attorney. Lawyers like to talk. So.
That we do.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And we like to write long briefs and continue things through the court
of words.
system. I will admit that.
One word we didn't see today from Camp Smollett was contrition. Absolutely no acknowledgement of what the jury found him guilty of perpetrating. Surprised by that?
I am, because, you know, leaving the decision about your freedom to a judge is very important. And they say that first step towards rehabilitation is admitting what you did wrong. And I think Judge Lynn was looking for that. And as he's sitting in chambers right now, he's saying, I really wish I would have heard from the defendant, although he won't hold it against him. That's not the proper way to do it. But typically, you just want to hear from the defendant in a case like this if you're weighing freedom versus incarceration. That's a tough call for anybody. And Judge Lynn, let me tell you something. He's a good judge. He's a fair judge. He has a conscience. He's going to follow what he thinks is the law, but he's also going to, I think, put a little mercy with punishment, to be honest with you. So I don't think he's going to send him to the penitentiary. That's not even what Webb asked for. But I do think that he may give him a little jail time. just because he committed perjury. He lied to the jury, he lied to the judge, and I think there has to be a price for that in the judge's mind.
So, Irv, if we look at some of the key witnesses, family members who testified on Jussie's behalf, and I know we've been talking about this earlier, even the body language did not come across as meek or remorseful. There was a lot of finger pointing, while the older brother said he didn't want to dwell on the fact that he was innocent. He still pounded it in and saying that he was. So what do you think should have been done differently if they wanted to get this outcome of no time in jail?
You know, talk about your brother in not the fact that he's guilty or innocent, but to talk about your brother, what a good relationship he had with him, maybe throw in a few episodes of doing things together while they were growing up, or the fact he's so proud of his brother for what he accomplished in, with the entertainment world, that he's, he lost his livelihood. He had a great future ahead of him, and now does not have a great future. And then when his grandmother got up there and she started to blame the media at the beginning of her statement, I'm sure Judge Lynn was shaking his head at that point in time.
I mean, because Jussie Smollett really used us as the media to get the story out there. I mean, he knew where to hit the third rail. And at that point in time, he hit a story contrived completely out of the park. Never seen anything like it. Irv, I don't think you've probably ever seen anything like it. Just the police resources, so on and so forth.
Absolutely, Brad. And the judge is arguing with himself right now in chambers as to what to do. It's one of these situations when you have aggravation, you have mitigation. I don't think Uche did his client any favors today by his last remarks to the judge. It's a class 4 felony. It doesn't mean anything. My God, it's a felony. It's not a misdemeanor. The fact that he's challenging the city of Chicago overtime remarks, where the city of Chicago said, we don't even want to get paid for just the regular time of our police officers. We just want to get paid for our overtime. And he challenged the amount of money that the city wants. That at a sentencing hearing, that's not what you want to focus on. You want to focus on your client, the good deeds that he's done, the fact that he's lost his livelihood, the fact that his, will stay on him for potentially the rest of his life if he's potentially given probation today. You got to look at what's important, and I don't think his lawyer did that today.
Yeah. So, Irv, now we're still waiting for the sentence, but the fact that Jussie Smollett was convicted on this class 4 felony and some of the political touch points that we saw with, say, the state's attorney and them deciding not to prosecute and then bringing in the special prosecutor, the charges being dropped at different points before that. What do you think the message or the precedent that this case is setting, what do you think that sends to the legal community here?
As a former assistant state's attorney, and after speaking to many other former assistant state's attorney, we all took this case personally because I think we felt that what was done at the initiation of this case wasn't right. It's not something we ever saw before. We hope the state's attorney's office does well. We're proud to be members of that office. When I was sworn as an assistant state's attorney many years ago, and I had to raise my right hand, and the person who swore me in said, we have one rule in this office, and that is you do the right thing. And I hope that the state's attorney's office gets back to that, because that's what a prosecutor's office should be doing.
And that was part of Dan Webb's damning assessment here. Dan Webb, when you're a guy like Dan Webb, you got a CV, a resume that could really choke a shredder. You take a case like this on, as you don't take it on for money. So you take it on for the clout. Your assessment of his not only performance, but logistically, how he handled things. When you looked at the report that he put together, showing the flaws in the state's attorney's initial, handling of this case, to what should grade him for us.
In this particular case, I think he did a great job. I read that report. I listened to his press conferences. You have to understand something. Judge Tooman could have appointed, one attorney to do this, but he picked Dan Webb not only because of Webb's reputation in the legal community, which is good. But also he had a huge law firm behind him, Winston & Strawn, to help out with the logistics of the case. I think it was very smart by Judge Newman to do that. And when you read the report and you see the way this case was presented to this jury, and you see how the post-trial motions were presented today, that's something that, as a lawyer, I think was very good. I think they'll use this case in law schools to try to show how a high-profile case should be tried in the future.
Oh, Irv, you've been with us from the start of this day when we were awaiting Jussie Smollett's arrival, and I know you said at the time, and it didn't seem to factor in, just as you said, that his late arrival would in any way influence the judge, at least not publicly, if the judge had anything to say about it. But for that to be the start of the impression that Jussie Smollett gives on a day when there's one man who decides your fate, talk to us about that.
Certainly not a smart thing to do, to show up late. Do I think that will influence the judge's decision on jail time? I don't. One thing I have to tell you, in the court systems under COVID, nothing runs smoothly. We don't know what excuse he may have had for showing up late. Frankly, if I was Mr. Smollett's attorney, I would have said, "I'll meet you in the cafeteria 2 hours before the court appearance so we could talk about the case. And so we'll be there in front of the judge 20 minutes early." That's what I would have done. But I was not Mr. Smollett's attorney.
Yeah, speaking of Mr. Smollett's attorney, do you think he was operating independently? Do you think he was advising his client, or in watching how things unfolded today, do you think his client was in control? Do you think his client said, "My grandmother and my brother will get up there defiantly defending my honor, saying this did not happen"? And while they say we're not going to relitigate it, that's exactly what they did. Do you think the counselor was in control, or do you think this was Jussie Smollett controlling the strings?
There's no doubt in my mind there was one captain of this ship, and that was not the lawyer. That was Mr. Smollett. I think Eric would agree with me when I say that, you're a lawyer. You can only advise your client. You tell your client, well, there's door number 1, door number 2, door number 3. I recommend door number 3. But if the client takes door number 1 or 2, that's the client's decision. But it's the lawyer's obligation to give their best legal advice to the client. But in criminal cases especially, the bottom line, it's up to the client, because it's not the lawyer that brings the toothbrush into the county jail. It's the client.
Yes, I do agree with you on that, Irv. If you could stand by for just a moment, Irv, I believe we also have Dana Kozloff. She has been with us since Jussie Smollett walked arm in arm with his family through the Layton Criminal Court lobby thereafter going through security. So Dana, we just want to touch base with you. Here we are, 1:30 for three plus hours into this, almost 4, if I'm counting correctly. Just set the scene for us out there.
Actually,
I know
more than 4.
Yeah, 1:30, 2:30. This is
a blur.
journalist with math. Here we go.
Right. Get out my abacus.
So from your vantage point as we are right now, I know it's definitely quieter down there than what we've been seeing in the courtroom, but just give us your perspective.
It really, as we have been since 11 o'clock or even earlier for some people all day, it's really in just a wait and see mode. And that includes obviously waiting for the sentence to be handed down by Judge James Lynn. But then what we do after that, we're set up so that if anybody wants to come down and make a statement, we're ready to do that, or we're ready to listen in and get that back to you. That's always optional. We expect that Dan Webb would make some sort of statement. He did after Smollett's guilty verdict was handed down. We also expect Smollett's attorney might also make a comment, as he did on the day of Smollett's conviction. And I know that the attorney for the Osendero brothers is here with one of the brothers. And I had asked her prior to her going into the courtroom if she would be available to speak. And she said she would as well. So we're set up for that, but we're just in a wait and see mode to bring you well, we don't even have to do it because you'll see it in court, but we're just here and we're waiting to talk to folks once that sentence is handed down. Brad and Erica.
Okay. Dana, it has been a long day of waiting and seeing, and the waiting continues. We appreciate your work down there. Let's go back to Irv. Irv, I mean, you believed, and anyone would believe, that the judge, knowing sentencing guidelines, he probably knows what the sentence is. We're told 5 minutes. Now it's 20 minutes. We know, you never can hold people to exact time frames. But is there, what could the hold up be here?
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, the judge could be looking at the clock and saying all the national news is on the various networks, and I may want to wait till 6 o'clock.
You think like we think, Irv.
Yeah. I'm just trying to give you an honest answer.
No, I mean, that absolutely could be it. Because, he wants this thing on live on broadcast.
He is, in fact, the one who granted the request then, right, to allow the cameras in the courtroom.
And there's an old expression that a judge is never late. It's only people who show up after the judge that are late.
Yeah. Any guy in a black robe. There's something about black robe syndrome, right? Or something like that.
Exactly.
So let's talk about the precedent, though. And although it was mundane, people are used to seeing highlights from court. Sometimes when they see the actual minutia and they see the weeds that are gone through in a hearing, you can lose some people to it interest-wise. But it was interesting to see a camera in a courtroom for sentencing in the state of Illinois. Do you believe this will be something we see more of now that it does happen here? And it's long happened in other states. Illinois was just for a long time had a moratorium, no cameras in courtrooms. Do you think this is something we will now see more?
I do. And, it actually started a few years ago, and particularly Judge Gahn and Judge Burns at 26 and Cal were in favor of cameras in the courtroom. But the one thing I have to say is the problem area is not the state court, it's federal court. There's no cameras in the courtroom, and basically reporters have to stay in the lobby, can't even broadcast from the floor of the courthouse.
So, Irv, I was just going back through the timeline here, and I know we have a lot of this online from Charlie DeMar breaking the story, but we're talking about 3 years. And boy, what have we seen in the 3-year period. But in terms of it happening during a pandemic, there being quite a few delays because of motions and everything that might come with a case like this from both sides. The timeline for finally getting to sentencing, Irv, do you think that this is what, every defendant wants, a right to a speedy trial? Do you feel that this went along with what we usually see in the Illinois court system?
Well, a defendant who's facing jail time does not want a speedy trial. A defendant who's looking at either an acquittal or probation, they're more in favor of a speedy trial. And, you have to figure in the pandemic into this. That just almost put the court system to a halt. And frankly, I don't know how the court system would have functioned if it wasn't functioned at all, if it wasn't for Zoom recordings.
Irv, don't mean to cut you off, never want to cut you off, but let's go to the courtroom right now. We believe court is back in session.
Constitutional, technical issues, and many more issues, substantive issues with this case. As a result, I've advised him not to make any allocution based on his appellate rights at this time.
Well, you may give him advice, but I need to hear from Mr. Smollett directly because it's his decision. So this is, do you want to say something or would you rather not say anything? That's fine. All right. All right, we're at the end of the road here. This matter has been pending in the criminal justice system for 3 years, approximately. It's been approximately 2 years on this particular docket. We have an original indictment that was returned by the Cook County State Attorney's Office. There's a quick dismissal that occurred in this case that caused tremendous consternation in the community, and to this day is a basis of great confusion and misunderstanding and mistrust. In any event, some things happened after the first dismissal, the only dismissal on the case after the first indictment. People were very upset. One person came forward in particular, and that person, of course, is Sheila O'Brien. Sheila O'Brien is a former retired appellate court justice in the state of Illinois. She came to court as a common citizen without credentials, just by herself, And she said she had a grievance and she wanted her grievance heard. And she thought that with the handling of the case by the state's attorney's office of Cook County was so upsetting that she was losing sleep. And she explained in her petition all the reasons that she thought that a special prosecutor had to be appointed, not to necessarily indict or do anything in particular, but just to look at this and give it a fresh look because something appeared to be wrong. The case ultimately got assigned to Judge Michael Tooman. And I can say that among his peers, among his fellow judges, Michael Tooman is considered cream of the crop. He's a long-standing veteran judge, been a judge longer than I've been a judge. He sat in this building for many years. He sat on the appellate court of Illinois. He's the current head of the juvenile justice system. He has been a long-standing judge who has a reputation for knowledge, integrity, honesty, and always knowing what the right thing to do is. He took this matter under advisement and hearings were conducted. And after all these hearings were conducted and he listened to both sides, he heard from the state's attorney of Cook County, he heard from Ms. O'Brien, he recognized that there was confusion in the public. There was concern that confidence in the criminal justice system locally here was at risk and may have been damaged, and that the case required a second look. And Michael Tooman, in his wisdom, sought out the proper, what he thought to be the right person to address this. He identified Dan Webb and the Winston Strong law firm as the people that might be able to take on the task. Dan Webb and Winston Strong agreed to take on the task. And as I already indicated, they did this pro bono, which means they did it for free. I don't know that at the time they signed up for this, that they had any idea that it was going to be as work intensive as this case has become. This case took several years, and we were slowed down by COVID a little bit, but the amount of pretrial motions that were filed were exhaustive. I have never, other than death penalty cases, which I used to preside over, seen anything like the extent of filing of pretrial motions. And I'm not faulting the defense for filing many motions. I will just say that this case received as much attention and was gone over every little bit of it by a fine-tooth comb as thoroughly as any case I've ever seen before. The stacks of pleadings are high. I've got stacks on my desk that are unprecedented. And we had to wade through all of them, and it took a long time to do that. And there was a tremendous amount of attorney manpower, billable hours that were lost by the Winston Strong firm. And they did it selflessly. They did it because they thought they needed to do the right thing. All I can say is, a member of the judiciary, thank you, because that was very, very extraordinary. And I have no idea what the amount of billable hours are, and I can only imagine, but I think it is huge and truly significant. In the event, what happened here is that after Mr. Webb in the case, they had several assignments, one of which was to look into the conduct of the state's attorney's office, and they returned a report to Judge Tooman about that, their findings about that, another about the Chicago Police Department and their handling the case. They did that. But what's relevant here, of course, is that they went to another grand jury and they returned a second indictment. And the second indictment ultimately, by random, got assigned to this particular court. And we came here. We've been here for a couple of years now. Well, the pretrial motions have been resolved. A trial by jury was held. The defendant was found guilty of 5 of 6 counts of felony disorderly conduct, class 4 offenses. Our post-trial motions have now been resolved. The pre-sentence investigation.
You're watching the CBS 2 News at 6 with our special coverage of the Smollett sentencing. Let's listen in to the judge.
In that sentencing. Let me talk first about the sentencing range, because I think there may be some misunderstanding, at least how the court assesses the sentencing range. This is a class 4 felony. This is the lowest class felony in the state of Illinois. I will note that legislatures throughout the country, in Illinois in particular, have constantly cut into judicial discretion and forced us to have mandatory sentencings under different circumstances. We have to do this and we have to do that, and try to have some kind of cookie cutter justice. But that does not exist in this case for me. I am left unfettered. Under Illinois law, the range of sentence in this case is as follows. Mr. Smollett is looking at a probationary term of up to 30 months. He can receive time in the county jail as a condition of probation of up to 180 days. He can be ordered to perform community service, ordered to participate in behavioral classes, order to pay restitution, order to pay a fine. He's also subject to a penitentiary sentence of what I find to be 1 to 3 years. Now, there's talk about, well, what about 5 counts? Shouldn't he be at least eligible for a 15-year sentence? There are ways to analyze Illinois law and say that in a case where there are 5 counts, that consecutive sentences might be required or might be at least considered. I don't believe that I could ever make the findings that are necessary in Illinois law, and I'm not going to have a long dissertation about it, but I don't think those findings would apply. I don't think Illinois law, for the facts I have before me, would allow for consecutive sentences. So as far as I'm concerned, the penitentiary sentence, should there be one, would be 1 to 3 years. I'm mindful that there's acute public interest in this case. We have television cameras that they want to be here, and they are here. People are watching. People seem to care passionately for varieties of reasons about this case, and the reasons are many. And let me be clear that the sentence that I put down today and render down to Mr. Smollett is not in any way, shape, or form to assuage any public sentiment in any form at all. I'm listening to things that were brought to me in court today, people that have participated in the aggravation and mitigation portions of the presentation today, but this is not for the public. The sentence that's going to be rendered today is going to be strictly for Mr. Smollett. It's going to be fashioned for him. And when a judge sentences somebody, and I've been doing this for quite a while now, you have to look at both the crime that was committed and the person that committed it. How did the person get here? Who is this person? What is the crime? You put them together, you look at the sentencing range, you try to find something that is just and fits and makes sense and that is right. And that's what we're going to do. Let me tell you, Mr. Smollett, I know that there is nothing that I will do here today that can come close to the damage you've already done to your own life. You've turned your life upside down by your misconduct and shenanigans. You've destroyed your life as you knew it. And there's nothing that any sentencing judge could do to you that can compare to the damage you've already caused yourself. So who is Jussie Smollett? Who are you? And how, out of all people in the world, did you get to be here, sitting in the courtroom in Chicago at a sentencing hearing, convicted of faking, hoaxing, racial and homophobic hate crimes? How in the world did this happen? Well, there are ironies in this case, and the ironies are many and they are profound. And I'm talking about the testimony I heard under oath from Mr. Smollett, corroborated in large part by the pre-sentence investigation. Mr. Smollett chose to take the witness stand, which of course is his right. He took an oath and he got on the witness stand, and the first thing he did was to introduce himself to the jury. He wanted the jury to know who he was, where he came from, what he was about. And I heard it on the witness stand. I heard it corroborated today by the witnesses that came and testified on his behalf. There's no question, Mr. Smollett was born into a mixed race family. His mom is an African-American woman. His dad was a white Jewish man. There were 6 siblings. And if you can say anything about this family, and we're talking about a very, very tight-knit family, a village that was always in sync with each other, that cared about each other, was completely, wholly supportive of each other. You know that this family knew about matters about social justice more than anything else. That's what the family stood for. It is part of the fabric of their existence. I know that Jussie Smollett grew up knowing to be sensitive to matters about racial discrimination, any kind of discrimination, any kind of social injustice. As a matter of fact, I'm learning more about it as we're going on in the letters I've been receiving and the testimony I've heard today. He's been doing this all his life. He doesn't just talk the talk, he's walking the walk. He's out there, he's advocating, he's involved in the community. He cares deeply about social justice issues. And for you now to sit here, convicted of hoaxing hate crimes, racial hate crimes, and homophobic hate crimes, the hypocrisy is just astounding. I don't know where to begin. I'll remember one thing that will always stick in my mind, and I've been involved in so many trials over the years, but something happened in this trial that it was remarkable, and it talks about your sensitivity to issues of social justice. You're on the witness stand. You're being cross-examined. Your liberty is at stake. It is your criminal trial. Mr. Webb is winding through some things on cross-examination, and he's going through some social media communications, and whether it was Instagram or chat or text, a little quibbling about that doesn't matter. But Mr. Webb found a line that he wanted to confront you with. He said, didn't you say, and he used a word starting with the letter N, meet me at this place at this time, and I'm paraphrasing. And rather than just answer the question, which what a witness is supposed to do and expected to do in their criminal trial, you stopped the proceedings. You said, Mr. Webb, out of respect for all the African-American people in this courtroom, you should not be using that word. And I was amazed, but it showed, and I'm not talking about the parrying and the gamesmanship that may go on between a prosecutor and a witness on the stand. That's not why I'm telling this, recalling this event. But what I'm talking about is how sensitive you were to any kind of slight, that anybody, if the wrong words come out of somebody else's mouth, you're going to get up and speak up and complain about it and make sure that they know that, that they're not behaving the way you're supposed to behave. So you know better than anybody else that these are serious matters. They're serious to you. They're clearly serious to you and as your whole family. And for you to be here now, convicted of these hate crimes, it's just astonishing. Faking hate crimes. So why did this happen? That's a good question. I think that's the question on everybody's mind. There's some conjecture you did it for the money. Frankly, I do not believe that you did it for the money. You were making, the evidence showed, close to $2 million a year when this happened. I don't think money motivated you at all. But the only thing I can find is that you really craved the attention and you wanted to get the attention and you were so invested in issues of social justice and you knew that this was a sore spot for everybody in this country. You knew this was a country that was slowly trying to heal past injustices and current injustices and trying to make a better future for each other. And it was a hard road. And you took some scabs off some healing wounds and you ripped them apart for one reason. You wanted to make yourself more famous. And for a while it worked. Everybody was talking about you. The lights are on you. You were actually throwing a national pity party for yourself. And why would you do such a thing? Why would you, I understand you crave the attention so much, but why would you betray something like social justice issues, which you care so much about? The only thing I could conclude is that, and I acknowledge there are wonderful sides to you. They're very giving and charitable and loving sides to you, but you have another side of you that is profoundly arrogant and selfish and narcissistic. That's the only thing that can be concluded. And that bad side of you came out during the course of all these events. Let me talk about hate crimes for a minute. I've been a criminal judge for many years, and I've heard many victims of crimes testify in front of me. And any victim of a crime, no matter what the crime is, they are demoralized by what happens to them. It doesn't matter if you're injured unjustifiably, if somebody hurts you and it maybe cripples you or damages you in some fashion that's going to be long-standing injuries. If your property is stolen, your vehicles are stolen, people go into your homes, your possessions are stolen, people do all kinds of terrible things. It is a demoralizing experience. And sometimes it's the worst experience that anybody can ever go through in their entire life. And then if it turns out that the motivation for the criminal to do something bad to you was because they hate you because of your race, because of your ethnicity, because of your gender, your sexual orientation, your religion, your age, your disability. If that was the reason for it, it is exponentially worse. There is nothing worse than to be a victim of a hate crime. It is the worst thing that can happen, especially in our country with all our history and all that we're going through now to try to get around some of these issues. Hate crimes are the absolute worst. And I believe that you did damage to real hate crimes, to hate crime victims. There are people that are actual, genuine victims of hate crimes that you did damage to. These are people that have a difficult time coming forward. They may be mistrustful. They may not want to bring it to the attention of the community or first responders. There may be some trepidation. I don't know for sure how much damage there was. I don't know how this is going to impact other people, if they're going to be hesitant to come forward because they're going to think that they're going to be accused of acting like you and doing a stunt like you pulled here. I don't know if first responders are going to be more doubtful and skeptical of people that come forward, real victims of hate crime, because of what you did here. I'm hoping it's not that way. Now I'll show one of the ironies in this case, and I find this pretty profound. I got letters from people that advocate about victims of hate crime their entire lives. They devote their lives to this. I'm talking in particular, Derek Johnson, president of the NAACP, Reverend Jussie Jackson, he's an icon here in Chicago, no introductions necessary. They devote their whole lives to addressing issues about social injustice and hate crimes. And they are here today asking me to show you mercy. And I take that seriously. I find it profound. I take it seriously. And I know that they're in a better position than myself to educate the public about that topic, about the damage you've done to real victims of hate crime. And I am confident that because of all the attention that you've garnered here on this case, that they are going to seize the opportunity and they will educate the public and they'll be talking about this. And they'll try to mitigate some of the damage that you've caused to real victims of hate crimes, and they're better positioned to do it than I am, and I will defer. But I will acknowledge that you have done some real damage. I'm going to talk about your premeditation. Again, I've been a criminal judge for many years, and I know that people end up where you are right now, awaiting sentencing on their criminal trial. And how did they get to court? How did that happen? There's some people that wake up in the morning, they have no intention of doing anything wrong. They're not looking to do anything criminal. They're on their minds. But there are crimes of impulse that happen. Road rage, a barroom fight, bumping into somebody, words are exchanged that somebody finds insulting, and sometimes weapons are available, and the results can be horrific, and they can be permanent. And people are sitting here and they're wondering themselves, how did I get here? I wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble just seemed to find them in crimes and impulse. And when I'm saying that I have to put the person and the crime together and try to mix them and understand who it is that committed this crime within the sentencing range, and that's part of my job to do, I consider how the person got here. So, but this is not a crime of impulse. There are also crimes of opportunity. Walking down the street and somebody they left the keys in the car with the motor running, and they take the car. Or they're in the department store and they see someone put the credit card on this side and they go to adjust their baggage on the other side and grab the credit card. Those are crimes of opportunity. They didn't wake up thinking they're going to commit a crime, but something just looked too tempting to them. They use very bad judgment, and then they get in trouble, they get caught, and here they are. But then there are crimes of premeditation. Mr. Smollett, that's what you are all about here, crime of premeditation. You did wake up in the morning thinking you were going to do something bad and something wrong. And I know more today about this than I ever did before, that there are some wonderful things about you. And I know how people, they cherish you, and they cherish your relationships, and they cherish the good works that you've done. And they love you sincerely and deeply. And they're not faking, they're not lying when they talk to me about their feelings about you and the good things that you've done. But you had that dark side, and this is what happened here. You premeditated this case to an extreme that's amazing. You wrote a script.
Chicago's first local news stream is now CBS.
Them. You were helping them. They wanted your advice. They would do anything for you. They thought you were one of the greatest people in the world to know, and that you could help them in their careers. They're in great shape. They gave you a little advice about diet and exercise, but they idolized you, and they would have done anything for you. And you chose them because you knew that you could trust them, that they were loyal to you. You paid them in advance by check. Not necessarily a good idea, but it was your idea. It was part of the plan that you would pay them in advance. And the check was out there. The check was shown into evidence. That was part of your premeditation. You chose a date. You chose a time. You chose a location. You had props procured. You gave them a $100 bill and had them get the supplies. What are the supplies in this case? Get masks. Nobody should see you. We're going to say that you're white, but obviously the Oceandero brothers are not white. We're going to cover your faces in masks. We're going to have a red hat because that's going to indicate MAGA country. We're going to get a rope that we're going to use as a noose. We're going to procure some bleach. You're going to have the supplies. And then you had all that together, and then you did rehearsals. You picked them up and you did drive-bys. You drove around and around the block. You picked them up in Lakeview in their neighborhood, and some distance away, you went to Streeterville where you were living, and you showed them. You're going here, you're going there, and you're going over the lines. You're going over the script with them so they would memorize the script. You're indicating which brother. You're the one that's going to hit me. You're the one that's going to put the noose around my neck and pour the bleach on me. This was planned. This was premeditated to the extreme. And I find that your extreme premeditation in this case is an aggravating factor today. Let's talk about the incident itself. It's all set up. The Oceandero brothers are on board. Your plane is running late. Now you had a chance right then and there to think, okay, I'm really late. I'm 4 hours late. This can't go down. It's freezing in Chicago. We're on the verge of a polar vortex. You might have just thought about it and said, you know, maybe it's not in the cards. Maybe the karma is wrong. I shouldn't be doing this. But no. You double down. You start communicating with the brothers through social media. Now, whether it was by texts or chats or Instagram, public or private, one way or another, you kept in touch with them. And there was some quibbling about the specifics about how you kept in touch with them, but they knew what time you were coming in. And now the time is pushed back to 2 o'clock in the morning in the freezing cold weather. It's double digits below zero at 2 o'clock in the morning. You have to have a reason to be out on the street. And the reason you chose is you come up with the story that you needed to get some eggs at Walgreens at 2 o'clock in the morning. If not that, you're going to go to Subway and get a sandwich and the salad and get something to eat at 2 o'clock in the morning in the freezing cold. You did one more thing. You got the Oceandero brothers. Now they're on board with you. You're using them as your patsies. You have your friend, you get your friend Brandon on the phone, and here's a man, professional man that's trying to help you in your career. You're not sure what town he's in, if he's in Australia or not, but you get him on the phone and he's going to be your patsy also, because he's going to listen and be around on the phone to hear that you're being attacked by somebody. Now, he doesn't know what's going on. It's really not an attack, but he's going to be able to corroborate your story. So you're getting that together. You got Brandon on the phone. You're out on the street ostensibly to get some Subway. You get some Subway, and you're walking to where this is supposed to take place. Now, the Oceandero brothers, they're getting ready too. And they're doing this because you wanted them to do it on the sneak. No cell phones involved. Make sure nobody sees you get there. And a little
until the clerk yells out, people of the state of Illinois versus Jussie Smollett. And at that time, the camera will get off the seal and you'll probably see the judge or you may see the parties. But when nothing is happening, the mic is off in the courtroom and you get that wonderful picture of the Cook County seal up there.
So, Irv, let's go back through the charges. As I know we're going to hear more of those as the judge begins, the sentencing, but we were talking about the 5 of the 6 counts, and you were making a good point earlier about all it takes is just one at this point for him to be facing potential probation, but also potential jail time and potential time in the penitentiary. So walk us through those counts. I know a lot of them, or basically all of them, hinge on Jussie Smollett lying to members of the police department, right?
Three members of the police department, 2 statements to 2 and 1 statement to another, actually 3 statements to another. And it doesn't make any difference. If he was convicted of count 1 and not guilty of the other counts, he'd be in the same position then as he is with the conviction of the counts that the jury did come back with guilties on.
And as you've been saying that, we've been giving our viewers just a little background here of those 5 or 6 counts. And we see count 1, that's what he was guilty on. Count 2 as well, telling the same officer he was the victim of a battery. He was found guilty on counts 3 and 4. Same claims against a different officer in count 5. It was that count 6, Irv, that he was not found guilty on. And what was that about there?
That was a statement to a different detective, and a couple of weeks later. And so the jury decided that that particular charge, there was not proof beyond a reasonable doubt, but there was proof beyond a reasonable doubt on the counts that they entered guilty findings on. And I remember after everybody came downstairs and the defense attorney talked to the news media, that was his big point. This has to be an inconsistent verdict. You can't find him guilty of 5 and not on 1. And I guarantee you, were his words, that this case will be reversed on appeal. It's not going to happen that way because the courts don't look at it as inconsistent verdicts that will result in a new trial. They look at what the jury used on each individual count. Hey, there was proof beyond a reasonable doubt on these. There wasn't proof beyond a reasonable doubt on the 1. No harm, no foul.
As we wait to take that courtroom shot full live for the actual hearing, which we will listen to in its entirety, Irv, I want to get you, I was struck by what you said about an hour or so ago. Let's role play some scenarios here. You said it will be critical, potentially critical for the judge to hear or not hear from Jussie Smollett. Roll through the scenarios. If he hears from Smollett, who basically says, I'm innocent, this whole thing has been a charade perpetrated against me, to, okay, I did it, I'm guilty, I'm sorry. Those words, which will be critical, could affect in a very real way his sentence.
No question about it, Brad. I mean, if he basically gets up there and sticks to the story that he told the jury, he may have well just have a toothbrush in his pocket. If he continues to demand that he's innocent and he was framed and, the police officers are lying and he's telling the truth. On the other hand, if he basically says, listen, I did lie to the jury, I'm sorry, I'm willing to take my punishment, I'm willing to pay the restitution to the city of the $130,000, I want closure in this case. And frankly, that's the only way that closure is going to happen, is if he takes that route, because if he's still demanding his innocence, and I have no problem with that, if that's the way he wants to do it. But then all that's going to lead to is an appeal in the appellate court. It's going to go on for months, if not years, and closure is not in the cards for that situation.
And Irv, if we can talk a minute about the special prosecutor, and we know, as Dana gave us some great background and a lot of this controversy with why the charges were dropped by the Cook County State's attorney, but Dan Webb, we saw him enter first, well ahead of schedule. Talk about his role in this and the significance of having a special prosecutor brought in for this case.
It's so rare that this happens. It's only happened several times in the last 10 years that I know of. And it's happened a couple times with Kim Fox's office. He basically volunteered to be the special prosecutor. It's my understanding he's doing it without any compensation to his law firm, with the exception of as costs, because he believes in the system. He believes that what happened in this case was wrong, the way it was handled by the state's attorney's office. And he's an aggressive prosecutor. He was that way when he was the United States attorney here in the Northern District of Illinois. He's well respected. He's well liked. People consider him fair. And it's really going to be interesting to hear what he has to say to the judge as far as what the appropriate sentence should be in this case in his mind. He may not. He may basically say, Judge, I'm asking you to impose a reasonable sentence. Or he may say, Judge, I think he should get probation plus restitution to the city. I believe he should get some community service. And one thing I'd like to add about the restitution to the city, he's not asking for all the money. He's asking for the overtime that was spent by the police department, not the normal pay that all these detectives and beat officers put in, only the overtime, not the hours and hours that were put in without overtime being paid.
Irv, thank you. We have our Charlie DeMar live in the courtroom right now, live tweeting. You just see the seal there right now. 19 minutes ago, Charlie just spoke with Ola Osundario as he arrived in court. He said he trusts James Lynn, the judge, to make the right decision and that he will accept whatever the sentence is. Of course, he's one of the two brothers who were critical in turning this in from an investigation into a potential hate crime into what it has now become, the crime that never took place. And then 9 minutes ago, so at 15 minutes after it was supposed to begin, Charlie DeMar tweeted, now Jussie Smollett has arrived for his sentencing hearing. So 15 minutes late there. Let's bring in one of our lawyers. Got a lot of lawyers here. We got Irv, we got Erica, and we've got Kimberly Agowan, our friend from WVON. Kimberly, I'm wondering your thoughts, what your listeners are telling you. Is there some type of demand for a pound of flesh out there? Do people have an investment in it? Do people care what the sentence is? Does he need to do jail time? Your thoughts?
Yeah, Brad, actually not at all. I don't think that our audience is demanding a pound of flesh. I think that they see this as something that's very low priority. Many people were not even thinking about the sentencing phase after he was convicted. I don't even know if anyone was paying much attention to the fact that the sentencing phase was, of course, something that had to take place. It is now taking place. So no, there's no call for the pound of flesh. I know that he almost preemptively did community service at Rainbow Push before he was finally charged again. See, everything is so confusing and convoluted the way in which it was handled. But we do know that he forfeited his bond and that he did community service already. And I just don't think that there is that will out there for individuals to really want to see them put the screws to him and lock him up forever. I do understand the need for trying to make sure that people do not do this again, which is lie about, make false charges and tie up the court system, tie up the police officers.
Okay, Kimberly, I think I've done this to you every time I've tossed you for a question. I've had to interrupt you. I apologize, my friend, but here we go. Jussie Smollett, front and center. The hearing begins, Erica.
SAMUELMENDENHALL from the Office of the Special Prosecutor.
Counsels?
Thank you. Judge, good morning. Lgbtqia N-E-N-Y-E, last name is C-H-E from Mr. Smollett.
Good afternoon. Shay Allen, first name is S-H-A-Y, on behalf of Mr. Smollett.
Heather Riddell, W-I-D-E-L-L, on behalf of Mr. Smollett. Tamara Walker, T-A-M-A-R-A, on behalf of Mr. Smollett.
Good afternoon, Mark Lewis, L-E-W-I-S.
Good afternoon, Tina Glenn, G-L-A-N-D-I-A-N, on behalf of Mr. Smollett.
Thank you, counsels. Everyone may be seated. All right, let the record show that a jury trial was held in this matter. Counsels, just find a seat if you will, please. Trial commenced on November 29th, 2021. Concluded on December 9th, 2021. Mr. Smollett was found guilty by a jury of 5 of 6 counts of felony disorderly conduct, class 4 offense. I expanded the filing period for filing post-trial motions beyond the 30-day limit due to the holidays and other restraints involving this case. I have received an 83-page post-trial motion filed by the defense and a 13-page response to the post-trial motion filed by the Office of Special Prosecutor. I will allow this, the defense to present arguments in support of the written motion. Ms. Blandy, if you wish to address the court.
Good afternoon.
Counsel.
As the court knows, we filed a comprehensive motion for judgment notwithstanding the verdict and or for a new trial outlining 13 different errors that occurred during Mr. Smollett's trial. However, the legal errors impacting Mr. Smollett predate this criminal trial and began long before this case was even assigned to Your Honor. I know the court has read our papers and there's been voluminous briefing, and we did incorporate by reference all of our prior briefing and arguments in this case. So I'm not going to belabor every single point. However, I do want to talk about 2 categories of critical errors that have permeated this trial. And that began again at the very outset and impacted this initial complete prosecution against Mr. Smollett. And in doing so, I'm going to highlight some of the most flagrant violations. The first category of legal error relates to this entire second prosecution of Mr. Smollett. The court knows the history, everybody knows the history, but I'm going to outline a couple key facts that occurred. A 16-count indictment was originally filed against Mr. Smollett on March 7, 2019. As part of a negotiated resolution, on March 26, 2019, the state's attorney's office moved to nollie pros all 16 counts. The Honorable Stephen Watkins granted the motion and dismissed the case against Mr. Smollett. As part of this negotiated agreement, Mr. Smollett was required to satisfy the Cook County State's Attorney's Office as to his longstanding community service, and he forfeited the $10,000 bail bond, which he was not required to do. Weeks after the case was dismissed on April 5th, 2019, a pro se litigant who lacked any standing to do so filed a petition to appoint a special prosecutor, which was ultimately granted by Judge Tooman on June 21st, 2019. Now, we've challenged the authority of the special prosecutor in different forms. However, when the case came before Your Honor, we filed a motion to dismiss here. The reason that was relevant is because Your Honor needs jurisdiction over both the matter and the defendant in order to proceed against him. And with all due respect, Your Honor lacks jurisdiction and lacked throughout the entirety of these proceedings. And this is because Judge Tooman exceeded his authority when he appointed a special prosecutor, and that's for various reasons. Illinois courts do not possess inherent authority to appoint a special prosecutor in any given case. Rather, the limited authority to appoint a special prosecutor is derived from statute, and it allows the court to appoint a special prosecutor in only 3 discrete situations. That's the first is when the state's attorney is unable to fulfill her prosecutorial duties. The second is if the state's attorney has an actual conflict of interest in the matter. And the third is when the state's attorney files a petition for recusal. Now, Judge Tooman found that the first of these 2 were not applicable in this case. And he granted the appointment of a special prosecutor on the third scenario. However, there was no petition for recusal filed in this case, and that's an undisputed fact. In fact, when Sheila O'Brien filed her petition for appointment of a special prosecutor, State's Attorney Kim Fox came forward and she expressly and unambiguously stated that she did not intend to formally or legally recuse herself. But the court nonetheless concluded that what she intended was basically an unconditional legal recusal. Now, subsection A-15 of the statute authorizing the appointment of a special prosecutor doesn't contain a provision which says the court can infer or interpret from the state's attorney's actions whether the state's attorney intended to recuse herself. Rather, the provision is explicit that the subsection only applies when the state's attorney files an actual petition for recusal, which Kim Foxx did not do in this case. Because the filing of a petition for recusal is an express statutory prerequisite to the appointment of a special prosecutor under subsection A-15, Judge Tuman exceeded his authority and violated the doctrine of separation of powers by usurping the role of the legislature and essentially redrafting the statute authorizing the appointment of a special prosecutor. Now, to compound matters, Sheila O'Brien also didn't have any standing to file the petition, and the court was not authorized to grant the appointment based on her petition. Now, the language in the special prosecutor statute is very clear as to who is allowed to petition the court for the appointment of a special prosecutor. The language is unambiguous and provides that only the court, the state's attorney, or a quote unquote interested party may petition the court for the appointment of a special prosecutor. Now, what's an interested party? Well, according to Black's Law Dictionary, an interested party is, quote, the persons who take part in the performance of any act or who are directly interested in any affair, contract, or conveyance, or who are actively concerned in the prosecution and defense of any legal proceeding. Sheila O'Brien doesn't meet any of the requirements of that definition. Sheila O'Brien is a retired former judge who asserted her standing as a concerned citizen, somebody who was not satisfied with the way a duly elected official of Cook County decided to resolve a criminal matter, a low-level, non-violent criminal offense, which they do every single day. But because of the high-profile nature of this case, she was not satisfied and she decided to file a petition. So it's undisputed that she was not an interested party. But putting aside that fact, only the first two subsections, the two that Judge Tuman said are inapplicable, even allow an interested party to file such a petition. Those are the two sections that say the court either on its own motion or on the motion of an interested party. Subsection A-15, which is the one that Judge Tuman relied on in granting the appointment of a special prosecutor, doesn't say that you could appoint a special prosecutor based on the court's own motion or on the petition of an interested party. That subsection only permits the appointment of a special prosecutor upon the state's attorney's filing of a petition for recusal. It is undisputed that no such petition was filed in this case and that State's Attorney Kim Foxx never intended to legally recuse herself. Therefore, it was completely exceeding Tuman's authority for him to grant the appointment of a special prosecutor at all. Now, he also misapprehended the law when he ruled that the informal recusal by Kim Foxx rendered the entirety of the proceedings from Mr. Smollett's initial arrest all the way through the dismissal of the charges against him null and void. And none of the cases cited by Judge Tuman in his order actually support the court's conclusion that the proceedings against Mr. Smollett are null and void, that the prior ones were null and void. Rather, those cases, and particularly People v. Woodall, and that's 333 Ill Act 3rd 1146, that's a 2002 case, makes clear that even if there had been a defect in the authority to prosecute Mr. Smollett, the only person who could properly challenge the validity of the proceedings would be Mr. Smollett, and he clearly did not do so. Now, separate and apart from the fact that the appointment of a special prosecutor was beyond Judge Tuman's authority, is the fact that Judge Tuman was not authorized to appoint a private attorney, which was Dan Webb and his law firm, Winston & Strawn, as the special prosecutors in this case. Subsection A-20 of the statute provides that prior to appointing a private attorney under this section, the court shall contact public agencies throughout the state to determine a public prosecutor's availability to serve as a special prosecutor at no cost to the county. And the key phrase here is shall appoint a public agency if they are able and willing to accept the appointment. The language in this subsection is mandatory and not permissive. Now, the defense is yet to see any proof that any public agencies whatsoever, including the ones specifically listed in the statute, were properly contacted about the potential appointment. Judge Tuman did represent that he contacted over 100 local public officials or agencies, and that he heard back from only around 30. But by Judge Tuman's own admission, at least 2 and possibly a third public agency was willing to take on the appointments. However, without any explanation, Judge Tuman unilaterally decided that none of these 3 public agencies were quote unquote able to do so, despite their representations to the contrary. The statute is very clear that the court shall appoint a public agency if they are able and willing to accept the appointment. It's only if after all public agencies have been exhausted and all are unable and unwilling to accept the appointment that the court can then appoint a private attorney, such as Dan Webb and his firm. There is no exception in the statute for private attorneys who might be willing to do the case pro bono or who are willing to do the case simply for costs, not charging for attorney's times, but for their costs, which for a firm like Winston & Strawn is probably still an astronomical amount. And I don't know what the total of the costs is. I know they were supposed to be filing reports with Judge Tuman, I believe every 3 months, to show the taxpayers what their prosecution of Mr. Smollett is costing in tax. And I would be curious to see that figure. I'm not sure what that is, but I would guess it's a substantial amount. But regardless, that is not contained within the statute. And here, because multiple agencies apparently indicated their willingness and ability to accept the appointment, Judge Tuman exceeded his authority and again violated the separation of powers doctrine by usurping the role of the legislator and appointing a private attorney as the special prosecutors in this case. The next issue I'd like to address is that the instant prosecution against Mr. Smollett violated a contractual right to immunity that he was promised by the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. In the original criminal proceedings, there was an immunity type non-prosecution agreement that was entered into between Mr. Smollett and the State's Attorney's Office as an agent of the people of the state of Illinois. Not only was this agreement agreed on between the parties, but it was actually executed and enforced by the courts. And it's something that's already been executed. This isn't something where they could renege because it's yet to be performed by either side, but this was actually executed by Mr. Smollett. And the state's promise to Mr. Smollett was that after he satisfied them as to his community service, after he forfeited his $10,000 in bail bond, that the state would not further prosecute him in connection with the January 29, 2019 attack on him. And here we are again in another case instituted, it might be by different attorneys, but it's on behalf of the state of Illinois. And there's a statute that controls, and that's section 5/114-1 of the Code of Criminal Procedure, and it allows the court to dismiss an indictment, and the court is required to dismiss an indictment where the defendant has received immunity from prosecution for the offense charged. And indeed, Illinois courts have consistently dismissed indictments that violate this section. And the courts here analyze informal immunity agreements under the same basic principles of contract law. So Mr. Smollett here performed his side, and he was entitled to the benefit of the bargain he made with the state's attorney's office on behalf of the state of Illinois, and that was violated. And in fact, the state's attorney's office, initially, they did perform their end of the bargain. They stood up in court in front of Judge Watkins, asked for the dismissal, and did what they had promised to do. And so at that point, the agreement was fully performed by both sides. The court enforced it, and there was absolutely no basis, and it was a violation of Mr. Smollett's rights to then re-prosecute him by the same principle, which is the state of Illinois. And there's important policy considerations for this, and the Starks Court, which is People v. Starks 106 Ill 2nd 441 1985, that's an Illinois Supreme Court case, And the Supreme Court in that case explained the significant policy considerations for this rule. And I quote, "The prosecution must honor the terms of agreements it makes with defendants. To dispute the validity of this precept would surely result in the total nullification of the bargaining system between the prosecution and the defense. Therefore, this court believes that if the prosecution did make an agreement with the defendant, it must abide by its agreement in this case." And there's one narrow line of exceptions that applies, and that's in an event of a plea agreement. Obviously, there was no such plea agreement in this case. And Mr. Smollett's present case fits squarely within Starks. And his due process rights have been violated as a result of the instant indictment because he was promised not to be hauled back into court, and that's exactly what happened here. And aside from having to face a second prosecution, he faced all of the things that are attendant with that, from the expense and emotional turmoil and everything else that the second prosecution has entailed. In short, Mr. Smollett relied on the representations by the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. And at the end of the day, a deal is a deal, and the state of Illinois is not exempt from that ancient principle. And so we would ask that the case should have been dismissed on that basis. Now, the next issue I'd like to address is the double jeopardy. And we had briefed this before. The court's very familiar with our position on this, but just in brief to highlight a few of our points. The double jeopardy clause does not just prohibit double prosecutions, it also prohibits double punishment. And to punish somebody twice for the same thing is a violation of the Fifth Amendment. And here, Mr. Smollett was clearly punished in the prior criminal proceedings by the imposition of a criminal penalty. Now, certain people may disagree with the severity of that punishment. They may not think that was a just result, but it doesn't take away from the fact that he was criminally punished. And even the Office of the Special Prosecutor, at the outset of the case, when they filed the new indictment, they issued on February 20th, 2020, something called an information release. And in that information release, Dan Webb himself acknowledged that Mr. Smollett had been punished during the prior criminal proceeding. And I quote him when I say that Mr. Webb stated that the only punishment for Mr. Smollett was to perform 15 hours of community service and requiring Mr. Smollett to forfeit his $10,000 bond as restitution to the city of Chicago. Those are Mr. Webb's words, not mine. And he said the only punishment. So he acknowledged that Mr. Smollett had been punished. But again, he wasn't satisfied with that punishment. And that's exactly what the double jeopardy clause is meant to prevent, second guessing of one prosecutor's discretion by another prosecutor. And that's exactly what happened in this case. There was absolutely no rational, non-punitive reason for Mr. Smollett's $10,000 bond forfeiture other than to serve as punishment. Upon the dismissal of the case, his bond normally would have been returned to him, less any bail costs, which would not exceed $100. However, despite Mr. Smollett's full compliance with all bail conditions, the forfeiture of his bond was required as a condition of the dismissal of charges against him. Therefore, this was obviously intended to punish him and serve deterrent purposes. And finally, the fact that he was not convicted of any crimes in the initial prosecution doesn't affect the analysis. In a case decided over 140 years ago, the United States Supreme Court explained, and I quote, "The compromise pleaded must operate for the protection of the distiller, in that case, against subsequent proceedings as fully as a former conviction or acquittal. He has been punished in the amount paid upon the settlement for the offense with which he was charged, and that should end the present action according to the principle on which a former acquittal or conviction may be invoked to protect against a second punishment for the same offense. To hold otherwise would be to sacrifice a great principle to the mere form of procedure and to render settlements with the government delusive and useless. And for those reasons, the indictment against Mr. Smollett should have been dismissed for violation of the double jeopardy clause." And so again, here we are at following a trial, and we should have never been here to begin with. There were various critical errors that permeated these proceedings, and the charges against Mr. Smollett and the second indictment should have been dismissed at the outset. Respectfully, Your Honor does not have jurisdiction over this matter, and we believe it was legal error to proceed. Now, the second category of errors I'm going to discuss are trial-related errors. And these errors began from the outset of the trial, beginning with jury selection, and they went all the way through closing arguments and even jury deliberations. And again, I'm not going to go through all 13 of the errors that we outlined in our papers, but I will highlight some of the critical ones that violated Mr. Smollett's constitutional rights. I think everyone can agree that this was one of the most high-profile cases in recent history. There was an immense amount of prejudicial pretrial publicity and an overwhelming presumption of Mr. Smollett's guilt long before a single piece of evidence was ever presented in a court of law. And this was in part due to a national press campaign by the former police superintendent, Eddie Johnson. And he went on national television on various networks, and he made blatantly false allegations of what the evidence in this case was. And there were three in particular, and these issues were never raised at trial because that's just not what the evidence was. Eddie Johnson went on TV and he said, Mr. Smollett did all of this because he was dissatisfied with his salary on Empire. That was completely a false assertion. That there was zero evidence of that whatsoever, but he went out there and said that and put that in the potential jury pool. He also said that Mr. Smollett had sent himself the letter. Mr. Smollett fully cooperated. He gave his DNA, he gave his fingerprints to the FBI, not to CPD, but he did that to the FBI, and there was no connection between him and the letter. That didn't prevent Eddie Johnson from going out there well before this case ever got to trial and tainting the jury pool with that false assertion. He also said that Mr. Smollett paid the brothers $3,500 for the attack. And it was the brothers' own attorneys who went on TV right after that and said, no, this was actually as corroborated with a lot of text messages between Jussie and Abimbola Asundario. He had hired Abimbola as his trainer, and that's what the $3,500 check was in fact for. Now, based on this overwhelming presumption of guilt in this case, it was critical that jury selection be fair so that Mr. Smollett would receive a fair trial if that was even possible. But there were fundamental errors in that process. First, the court violated Mr. Smollett's Sixth Amendment rights by preventing the defense from actively participating in the voir dire process. The defense sought to directly question the veneer, but the court denied that request. And although the court asked the parties and took questions from both sides as to certain questions that should be asked of the potential jurors, Your Honor didn't ask all of the questions that the defense requested. By refusing to allow the defense to meaningfully participate in the voir dire process, the court prejudiced the defendant's ability to discover those members of the potential panel with biases and or potential prejudices against Mr. Smollett, violating his Sixth Amendment rights. Although the court repeatedly stated that you didn't want to treat this case any different than other cases, this was an abuse of discretion in this case because of the prejudicial pretrial publicity, which could not be ignored.
And you think I was required to ask every question submitted by your team to the veneer, every single one?
We think we should have been allowed to participate in this process because of the unique circumstances of this case where there was such an overwhelming presumption of guilt. We think it's a very different process when the court asks questions and when we as attorneys get to ask the right follow-up, in real time without having to wait for, there were certain questions the court asked, and this was my next point with Rosemary Mazzola, where the court cut off the answers.
I asked most of the questions the defense requested of me. There are some I did not. For example, you wanted me to ask the veneer, what kind of animal would you like to be if you had to be an animal? Or Superman or Batman, what do you prefer? Did you really think I was supposed to ask a denier when I'm choosing a jury in a criminal case, those kind of questions?
We identified certain questions in our motion that we think, I believe there were 4 questions that we thought were critical, not the ones Your Honor just mentioned, but there were important.
That was part of the pool of questions I received from you.
Right, but there were important questions that were not asked. And the more significant factor is we should have been allowed to question the veneer in this case. Again, I'm not saying in every case. I respect that Your Honor doesn't do that in a lot of other cases. However, this case is obviously unique. Mr. Smollett, unfortunately for him, has not been treated like anyone else charged with class 4 felonies. He's been disadvantaged at every turn, and his jury selection.
I pick a jury in this case the same way I pick a jury in a murder case. I do the questions. I ask the lawyers for input. Tell me what questions you want me to ask. I vet them. And I'm happy to ask the questions that are relevant and helpful.
I understand, Your Honor.
But just the only point I'm trying to make is that I absolutely treated him the same as everybody else. And I didn't distinguish him from a class 4 offender, a potential offender, from a person accused of murder.
I understand, and I think, Your Honor, that's the problem here. A regular murder defendant doesn't walk into court with a presumption of guilt. Mr. Smollett did. There is a presumption of innocence. That was non-existent in this case, and that was due in large part to, as I said, the former police superintendent held a press conference. He went out and did a media campaign. The mayor spoke out on this case. Even Judge Tuman, in his order, before a single piece of evidence had been set forth before Judge Tuman, he convicted Mr. Smollett in his order. He talked about what a charade this was, and he made findings. And Judge Tuman should have been recused. We actually filed a motion for him to recuse himself because based on the face of the order, it was clear that he harbored bias against Mr. Smollett and was convinced of his guilt when he was not ruling on a motion that involved, there was no factual dispute before him. There was no evidence presented to him. And he nonetheless took it upon himself to make improper factual findings, which evidenced his bias. He should have recused himself. However, he didn't even let us intervene in those proceedings to consider our motion for recusal and to consider our motion for reconsideration of the order appointing the special prosecutor. And all of that was there. But to Your Honor's point, the reason I think Your Honor should have treated this case differently is for all the reasons I stated, which is he does not sit and he did not come before Your Honor the same as other defendants with a presumption of innocence, which is what he is afforded and entitled to under the Constitution. Instead, he walked in. I've never seen presumption of guilt the way Mr. Smollett faced. And it deprived him of a fair trial, and the court should have taken precautionary measures during jury selection. There should have been more leeway in this particular case. We made that request, and with all due respect, we believe it was error for the court to deny our active participation in the voir dire process and to ask the questions that we thought were important to be asked. Now, turning to a specific juror, which was Rosemary Mazzola, we specifically asked the court in chambers to further inquire of Ms. Mazzola, since she had said in open court that pretty much her entire immediate family are either current or former law enforcement. And there had been no follow-up to ascertain the fact as to whether Ms. Mazzola may have a family member who is actually involved in the investigation of Mr. Smollett or any of the facts surrounding his case. And we brought that to the court's attention. We thought that was a critical question that should be asked, because if we knew one of her relatives, for instance, was involved and helped investigate this case or was partners with someone who was investigating this case, that would have been critical, and obviously she should have been removed for cause. The court denied our request, and we don't think there was any good basis not to bring Ms. Mazzola in and ask her these important questions to make sure that she is unbiased and that she did have no personal conflict. And in fact, several times when Ms. Mazzola was answering the court's question, Your Honor interrupted her, and we don't actually know what she was intending to tell the court and the parties. And for all those reasons, we think that the jury selection process, and the other reasons obviously outlined in our motions, was flawed, and that a new trial must be granted. We also outlined in our papers the improper denial of several Batson motions in response to the Office of the Special Prosecutor's peremptory challenges, which we believe were improperly used to remove jurors based on their race and sexual orientation. Now, I'm not going to detail each of the peremptory challenges that we've outlined in our papers, But in short, anybody looking at this jury can tell that it was not a jury of Mr. Smollett's peers in Chicago. And we think that these significant issues during jury selection deprive Mr. Smollett of his constitutional right to a fair trial, and the remedy is to grant him a new trial. I'm next going to address the issue of prosecutorial misconduct. And this relates to an independent eyewitness, Anthony Moore, who was working as a loss prevention officer for the Sheraton on the night Mr. Smollett was attacked. Now, Mr. Moore does not know Mr. Smollett personally. He was a completely independent witness that police on their own interviewed multiple times. And Mr. Moore spoke to the detectives on at least 3 occasions, including on February 2nd, 2019, and on February 27, 2019 at Area Station. On each of these occasions, Mr. Moore unequivocally told police that around 2 a.m. as he was doing his rounds at the Sheraton, he saw 2 men running towards him from the area where the attack occurred. He said he flashed his flashlight on the first man's face, and he saw a white male wearing a ski mask. Mr. Moore could not see the second man's face. And Mr. Moore was entirely consistent with his repeated descriptions, and he never expressed any doubt as to what he saw. In fact, when asked to view a photo lineup at the station with only Black men included, Mr. Moore told officers that the man couldn't be in the lineup because the man he saw was white. This description of a white male wearing a ski mask was exactly what Mr. Smollett had seen and described to officers. Mr. Moore was a key defense witness, as his testimony provided at the very least reasonable doubt that Mr. Smollett was truthful in his account of what he saw that night. Now, a year later, on January 29th, 2020, prosecutors from the Office of the Special Prosecutor met with Mr. Moore for a lengthy period of time, and they chose not to video record this interview. At trial, Mr. Moore testified that at this meeting, they showed him the CPD's evidence against Mr. Smollett, including surveillance footage and pictures of the Asandario brothers, who they said were Mr. Smollett's attackers. Mr. Moore testified at trial that he felt, quote unquote, pressured and threatened to say he saw something he didn't see. And exhausted after hours of telling prosecutors something they did not want to hear, he eventually signed a statement saying he could have been mistaken when he saw a white man because maybe when he flashed the flashlight on his face, it was the reflection from the light that made him think that the individual was white. There was absolutely no reason for the Office of the Special Prosecutor to try to taint an independent eyewitness's clear memory of an event by showing him their version of the evidence and trying to scare him that he would be committing perjury if he testified consistent with his own independent memory of what he saw. This form of intimidation constitutes egregious prosecutorial misconduct and violates Mr. Smollett's fundamental right to present witnesses in his defense. By having Mr. Moore change his statement in writing, not only did the Office of the Special Prosecutor try to disqualify Mr. Moore as an exculpatory defense witness, they actually tried to obtain false incriminating evidence against Mr. Smollett. Although Mr. Moore on the stand tried to explain the reasons, he gave the written statement stating he could have been mistaken about the skin color of the man he saw, the prosecutorial misconduct inevitably discredited Mr. Moore. And this flagrant misconduct constitutes reversible error. Now,